Orcaseye Skylines by Justin Norris. Here, time was impossible to determine, because in this room, this dim, massive cathedral of a room, there were no windows, no clocks, only walls. And on those walls, hundreds of reflective steel panels so convincingly created the illusion of eternity. Ascari's intent behind the design had always been to personify Anura's ultimate purpose. If one were to stop and gaze at his or her reflection, a never-ending succession of duplicates would be staring back, all possessing the same expressions, the same gestures, the same emotions, fears, yearnings, and experiences. A reminder that there was always another in need, another on the brink. In this room, each contributor was reminded of what they stood for and why they served as a child of Anura. And on this night, the family convened once more, gazing upon their thousand selves within the steel walls, just as they had done before every previous assignment, cultivating the confidence to bring the others home safely, the millions of others currently lost in chaos. Bold green text appeared on the large projector screen affixed to the balcony above the golden elevator, and yet again, the alarm sounded. 3 separate rapid vibrations shook the mirrored walls, and the children turned to the screen, eagerly waiting for the digital text to finish crawling. Name, Jeremiah Drake. Age, 31. Sex, male. Location, Orcaseye. Alert level, Stage 5 out of 10. Prior alerts, 2. Ascari stepped onto the gold-plated platform in the center of the room, and the children arose from their seats to face him. Ascari read the client's profile aloud with a powerful and prominent voice, each utterance echoing over the next. Jeremiah Drake's image faded onto the screen as the details of his history were unveiled. Once finished, Ascari adjusted the pin on his uniform and kept his eyes on Jeremiah's digital projection.
"As we serve,"
Ascari declared.
"As we serve,"
the children called back in perfect unison. Chapter 1. 3%. 3. The number leered back from the screen as if it were mocking him. With the simple click of an email, all of the attempts at standing up to the district immediately became meaningless. This was what started it all. The raise, if that's what we want to call it anyway. Jeremiah slammed the laptop shut, startling the students while they watched the clock, waiting patiently for the bell to ring. The teachers did so much to fight for 12%, but this is all they ended up with. Who did the district think they were? Every day the teachers wore orange buttons or orange t-shirts to show their solidarity. Every lunch period on Fridays they locked their doors to keep the students out. It wasn't because they wanted to, obviously. They had to show that their time was valuable and that they deserved better compensation for the time they constantly sacrificed, day in and day out. Jeremiah, especially. 4 out of 5 days a week ever since he started 4 years ago, Jeremiah's car was always the last one to leave the parking lot. Whether he was helping a student get caught up with missing assignments or talking with another about some boyfriend or girlfriend drama, Jeremiah was always there for his students. He was an educator, a mentor, a counselor, and for some, a father. But as time went on, he started to shut himself off to everyone around him. Even Julianne. After all of her hospital bills, from the emergency visits to the chemo, life had become more about money than anything else. It was all they talked about, all they fought about. And now the only one he could truly call his friend was one of his own students, Connor. As the bell rang for class to end, Jeremiah already had his bag packed, ready to run to his car and drive out to the beach. All day he'd been looking forward to listening to the waves and soaking in some sun. It wasn't San Diego, but it was better than nothing. This week couldn't have been more of a drag. "Any weekend plans, Mr. Drake?" Connor said, zipping up his backpack, which was clearly empty. Oh, the usual. Listen to my wife drone on about her next trip to South America or Australia or wherever, while I delve into the exciting world of grading essays. You? Wow, sounds fun, Connor said. I'm probably just going to get grounded for simply existing as soon as I get home, you know? Ain't it the life? Connor shook his head. You pick up the latest Dollar Underwater album yet? No, I've got bills stacked to the clouds. You sure? Or does your wife tell you what music you can and can't listen to? Jeremiah smirked. No, but I wouldn't be surprised if she started to. Connor laughed. Whipped? Get out of here with that. It'll happen to you too. You'll see. Soon you'll be answering back with, yes, dear, just like all of us old fogies. Nah, I'm never gonna get married. Well, quit being such a loser and maybe you'll actually get a date one of these days, Jeremiah said as he mimicked Connor's laugh. You get any more sketches done? No, just been lazy. Might get back to it this weekend if I can get away from my dad for long enough. Hopefully I'll be able to stay with my mom instead. I hope so too. I want to check out your new stuff whenever you feel like showing me. Cool. If I finish anything, I'll show you on Monday. Sounds good, Connor. Have a good weekend, man. Yeah, right. You too, Mr. Drake. Connor threw his backpack over his shoulder and Jeremiah sauntered to his desk to grab his car keys from the drawer. When he opened the classroom door, he couldn't believe his eyes. Another thunderstorm. The third one this week. You can't be serious right now, he said with a weary sigh. It's March. The rain pattered against the concrete like falling marbles. There was no way he'd be able to enjoy the beach now. He didn't care to walk back into his classroom to look for his umbrella, so he locked the door behind him and left. Students passed him in the hallway, some saying hi or nodding in acknowledgement. Jeremiah didn't give any sign of recognition. Colleagues waved goodbye through their car windows as they drove past, but he stayed rigid, his eyes forward. Soaked, Jeremiah unlocked his car, tossed his bag in the back, and plopped down in the driver's seat. He heaved a sigh, shoved the key in the ignition, and headbutted the steering wheel. Once, twice, 3 times. The rushing rivulets on the windshield concealed his sudden burst of frustration from any passersby. At least he'd thought. After the third thrust of his forehead, he gradually sat back up, and Julianne entered his mind as he looked out the window. Connor, too. He searched his brain for a third person, but no one came to mind. Was it true? Was that it? Were they the only people he had? Oh well, like he needed anyone else anyway. Just another person to tell him what he was doing wrong. With Julianne's newfound respect for life, all she seemed to care about were butterflies and traveling. Her career was finally being given a chance to take off, sure, but it seemed as if they hardly talked anymore about their future. With money being as scarce as it was, the idea of raising a family had to be put on the back burner ever since he realized that he'd have to get a second job if a kid were to enter the picture. That just wasn't an option. He hardly cared about teaching anymore as it was, which wasn't exactly a gold mine. It was hard to care about anything, really, except the beach. But here he was, in the middle of another storm. So that wasn't happening. Jeremiah threw the car in reverse, turned his body, and immediately slammed on the brakes. Jesus Christ, get the hell out of the way. These kids, I swear. Someone was standing behind Jeremiah's car. The rain on the rear window made it difficult to see who it was exactly, but upon further inspection, it definitely wasn't a student. It was a grown woman, wearing some kind of one-piece uniform. It wasn't one of the custodians, and it wasn't anyone from administration. It wasn't anyone he recognized. Eventually, the woman slowly moved over, and Jeremiah was clear to back up. After getting a better view of her through the driver's side window, Jeremiah saw that she might be a school bus driver trying to maintain order among the gaggle of students exiting campus. It was strange, however, because the woman's uniform was pristine, black, with a small shiny pin on the breast pocket. The woman, with somber eyes and an unblinking stare, had a noticeable pink scar that stretched all the way across her slender neck. "Take a picture, lady," Jeremiah said under his breath. The woman wouldn't shake her eye contact with him. As Jeremiah eased his foot against the gas, she kept her eyes glued to Jeremiah as he drove away. Looking in his rearview mirror, Jeremiah kept his eyes on the woman as well. During the entire trip through the parking lot, she wouldn't budge. All the way past the driveway and down the street, the mysterious woman kept her eyes locked on Jeremiah's every move until he was no longer in the same field of view. Jeremiah swallowed and turned on the windshield wipers. "People are strange," he said aloud, turning on the radio. "Who needs them?" Chapter 2. "Why aren't you more excited about this, Jeremiah?" Julianne asked, sitting at the dinner table with her research journal lying open next to her plate. "This is the Terra dream we're talking about here. No species more rare. The only proof of its existence is in one single photograph taken back in the 80s. She pointed to a photocopy of the image she was referring to in her journal. He glanced at it, and though he'd never say it out loud, especially now, Jeremiah was moved in a way he wasn't expecting to be. The butterfly was impressive, that he had to admit. Its large wingspan, its vivid blue wings, but Jeremiah refused to offer any sort of response, so he continued to pick at his cold steak with his fork. "Are you even listening to me?" Jeremiah looked up from his plate. "Oh, yeah, no, it's great, Jules. I really hope you find what you're looking for." All of the butterfly jargon she started rattling off was way over his head. Though the image of the Terra dream was quite a sight, the truth was, he couldn't care less about anything else she had to say. "Could you imagine what that would do for my career? For us? If I were the one to find it? This is some award-winning stuff here, honey." Julianne's words became inaudible strands of noise, and Jeremiah lost himself once again as he picked at his dried slab of sirloin. Julianne continued, "That's why I have to get on a plane first thing tomorrow morning after my appointment with Dr. Stocks. I have to be the first one to find it, otherwise my chances just fly out the window." Silence lingered between the two. Jeremiah kept his head down. "Okay, you know what? Forget I said anything. You're obviously not listening to a word I say anyway." Jeremiah remained motionless. Julianne grabbed her dinner plate and stormed off from the table. When she reached the sink, she slammed her plate into it and raised her voice. "I don't understand. I mean, just 2 months ago, we got the best news either of us could have hoped for, and you can't even say a word to me at dinner? What's going on with you?" Still, Jeremiah showed no sign of acknowledgement. Julianne took a breath. She reached behind her neck with both hands and removed her necklace. Gold, interlaced with white pearls, and a small butterfly dangling from the center. It was her favorite, an anniversary gift. "I understand that you didn't get the raise that you'd been wanting. I know it's frustrating, but I'm trying to actually enjoy my days again. A whole year I could barely even get out of bed, and now I have energy, Jeremiah. I can finally do what I love again. And you just don't give a shit about any of it. Why?" After a few moments of silence, Jeremiah showed signs of life as he watched her drape the necklace over the counter in the reflection of the living room mirror across from him. He pushed his chair back and stood up. Turning around, wiping his chapped lips with his napkin, he faced his wife. His shoulders slumped, his voice broken. Jeremiah responded to the interrogation. "I'll tell you why. One time. Then you need to get off my back." Julianne folded her arms and pushed her blonde bangs behind her ear. "I hate being at work. I hate being here. I hate that I work tirelessly every goddamn day and have nothing to show for it." Julianne looked down at her feet. "Is that it? Also, I hate living on the East Coast. I can't stand this constant rain. Does spring even exist in this part of the country, or what? And why don't you seem to care that I'm the only one trying to take care of our bills? How can you actually have the nerve to get mad at me when I don't show the least bit of excitement about your damn butterflies every minute of every day? Because guess what? I don't give a shit. Okay?" I'm doing it all on my own, and now I just want to be left the hell alone. Julianne's arms fell to either side, and she stood expressionless. Her lips folded into a frown as Jeremiah stood patiently for any sort of response. I'm sorry that you feel that way, Jeremiah. Really, I am, she said, her voice weakening. I'm sorry that you can't seem to see how much I care about you, about us, by working my ass off to make up for the fact that your school district doesn't give a shit about you or any of the other teachers working for them. No, I'm not making any money right now, but I'm trying to get back on my feet. Well, you need to try harder. A look of shock shot across her face. Wow, have you forgotten about all of the hell that I've been through this year, Jeremiah? And apparently all you'd rather do is die alone in this awful place we've built together? I really hope you can find something that gives you the strength to help push yourself past this, whatever it is. Because you are not the man I married. Julianne stormed past him as the tears rolled down her cheeks, with a vehement stare as she rushed to the bedroom. The door slammed from the other end of the hallway, resounding through the house, and Jeremiah stood up from the table, turning to face the refrigerator. The swarm of miniature pastel butterfly magnets on the freezer had caught his attention. Some were upside down, some sideways, and a portion of the transparent blue wing on one in particular was chipped off. Usually he'd take the time to adjust them when they'd get out of place like this, always cast into disarray by the crashing of the freezer door at the end of a heated argument. But this time, instead of rearranging them back into their usual delicate order, Jeremiah thrust his fist into the freezer, and the magnets dropped, collided with the tile, and shattered. The dented door hung agape on its incredulous hinges, and the frigid air spilled into the kitchen. Aside from the hum of the open freezer, the kitchen fell quiet. Jeremiah turned and caught his reflection in the living room mirror. He looked worn, stressed. He couldn't remember the last time he'd stopped to look at himself. The grays in his beard were prominent. His thinning brown hair hung over his eyebrows, matted with sweat across his forehead. He hardly recognized the man in the frame. Connor came to mind. He didn't know why. Perhaps he wanted to talk to him, or see him. It was an odd thing to think about in this moment, but it was nothing he hadn't thought before. Connor was the only one he'd felt close to anymore. It was as simple as that. Since Julianne's diagnosis, normal conversation was something that fell by the wayside, as every conversation became about the cancer. But with Connor, he had someone to confide in, someone to talk about music with, about art and movies. And though he might be wrong, Jeremiah considered the feeling to be mutual. The evidence was there. For the past year, Connor had come into Jeremiah's classroom every day at lunch, even a few times after school. Would they converse much? Here and there in the beginning, but eventually Connor became the one doing most of the talking. It got to a point where Jeremiah would often kick Connor out so he could eat lunch alone in his car, devoid of human contact. If the feeling were mutual, Jeremiah hadn't been much of a friend, and nowhere near the definition of a mentor. Not like he was at first. Jeremiah shook the thought and turned away from the mirror. He clutched his hand and glanced at the cuts along his knuckles. He traced his fingers through the blood and walked toward the hallway closet to grab a pillowcase to wrap his hand, something his mother always did for him when he'd get a cut or a scrape as a child. It was an unusual choice, he thought. Why did she always use a pillowcase? Why not a towel, or something more medical, like gauze or a regular bandage even? In the end, it didn't really matter. The memory brought him an immediate sense of ease. The pillowcases made him feel safe, protected. His mother had a way with calming him, with assuaging the fear. He opened the closet, and it was crammed with white bedding. The sight reminded him of the seemingly endless nights dealing with Julianne's coughing fits. Almost every day, she'd wake up on a blood-stained pillow or sheet, and he'd have to buy new bedding. Soon enough, however, the stains had become the least of their concerns. His mind shifted back to his mother's hands, and he wondered if he'd ever get the opportunity to protect a child of his own. That was it. All he ever wanted. A family. But as each day passed, the idea seemed to fade further into obscurity. It just wasn't realistic anymore. With no money, a job he could no longer find the joy in, and a relationship on the brink of ruin, he wondered what was left to look forward to. Julianne didn't seem to care about starting a family anymore, not as much as she cared about her butterflies. Everything seemed broken beyond repair. Foundations rotted, futures blemished. He pulled a fresh pillowcase from the shelf and could hear Julianne crying from the bedroom. He approached the door and leaned his ear against it. Every voice in his head told him to go in and talk to her. But he had no energy, no desire. Instead, he wrapped his hand, pulled his keys from his pocket, and hurried through the front door, slamming it in his wake. Chapter 3. Only 3 minutes remained until the bell would ring, signaling the end of the day. The students sat silently, a mass of shifting impatience and half-hearted sighs. Jeremiah's eyes were closed while he leaned his weight against the podium in the front of his classroom. He wasn't asleep, though he wished that he were. The students filed out as the bell rang, the door swinging open to reveal yet another gloomy, rainy afternoon. Several of his students said goodbye, though Jeremiah's eyes remained shut, his demeanor disengaged, and said nothing. "Mr. Drake, you okay?" Jeremiah opened his eyes to see Connor standing nearby. Yeah, great," Jeremiah muttered after clearing his throat. Connor took a step closer. "Well, you look like shit." Jeremiah wiped his eyes and stretched his arms out toward the ceiling, emitting a boisterous groan. "I didn't sleep. Spent the night in a hotel." "Oh shit, you and Julianne get in another fight?" Jeremiah laughed. "Yeah, a big one. I finally let her have it." "What happened?" "Well, I pretty much told her that I didn't care about anything anymore. My job, her job, myself. I even said I stopped caring about us. She locked the bedroom door and I left. Haven't been home since." "Are you going back tonight?" "I've honestly never considered sleeping in my classroom until today." Connor gagged. "Gross. You have seen the cockroaches that crawl around here at night, right?" "Thanks for that. Now I have to go back home." "Which hotel did you stay at? Just go back for another night." "The Lazy Whale." Connor's eyes widened. "Never mind. You're better off sleeping in here. Cockroaches are probably friendlier than whatever the hell they've got infesting that place." Jeremiah smiled. "Probably. And believe it or not, I barely had the money to get a room for one night." "That sucks, man. Hopefully things work out." Jeremiah caught a glimpse of the inside of Connor's backpack, some paper and a couple of small tin containers. "Hey, you got that new sketch in there or what?" Connor looked at his bag and zipped it up with haste. "Oh, yeah, but it's not done yet. Probably by, Wednesday. I'll show you then." He threw his bag over his shoulder and headed toward the classroom door. "I'm going to finish up. I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Drake." Caught off guard by Connor's sudden need to leave, Jeremiah didn't say anything back. The classroom door swung open, and he watched Connor hustle into the hallway, never looking back. From his open laptop, an alert notified him of an incoming email. Jeremiah sighed. I know, I didn't take attendance again," he whined. "Sue me." He stood from his stool, sauntered over to his desk, and read the subject line. "Attention, changes in bank statement." "What the hell is this?" he whispered to himself as he clicked the mouse with trembling fingers. The email opened to a short blurb of text. "Dear valued Orcaseye Union account holder, this is an overdraft alert. Your account balance, negative $142.50. Overdraft fee, $50. A dull ache grew in the pit of Jeremiah's gut, clawed up his throat, and resounded through his teeth. Immediately, he opened a new tab and logged into his account to confirm the contents of the email, and it was true. The reality of the situation had begun to sink in, and he slammed his laptop shut. In a rapid blur of motion, he shoved it into his bag, grabbed his keys, and burst through the classroom door. Fellow teachers and students greeted him as they walked past, but Jeremiah ignored every word and rushed to the parking lot with a raging temper, his mind racing with abhorrent curses. He threw his belongings in the back seat, got into his car, and bolted out of the parking lot. As he sped away from the high school and down Expenditure Drive, Jeremiah wove in and out of traffic, the speedometer climbing to almost 80 miles per hour, coming dreadfully close to clipping every car he drove past. His knuckles burned white as he clung to the steering wheel, and he started to laugh to himself as the rainfall became stronger. Given the situation, there was simply nothing left to do. The sound of blaring horns permeated the air around him, and the street seemed to narrow as he pressed harder on the gas. Pedestrians dove back toward the sidewalk to avoid being hit. He couldn't stop laughing. He questioned why him? Out of all people, why did the universe have to put a target on his back? With a career he now loathed, a wife he could no longer stand to be around, and now an empty wallet, and a bank account with nothing to his name, there was no way life could deal a lower blow. Jeremiah's phone, sitting on the passenger seat, alerted him with a new text message. With a quick glance to his right, he saw that the message was from Julianne. He picked up the phone. "You need to call me. We have to talk. There isn't much time." Shards of glass flew from all sides and everything became weightless when Jeremiah's car was thrust into the air. Two loud thumps as Jeremiah's head smacked against the steering wheel. The world turned crimson, and he screamed just before being knocked unconscious. His car rolled several more times before landing on the roof and skidding into a fire hydrant. The car's horn screamed into the afternoon sky as the metal cage finally came to a halt. An icy splash from the geyser collided with the undercarriage and jarred Jeremiah awake. Lying on his back against the asphalt, the sun peeked through the dark clouds, and the rainfall gradually faded. He couldn't feel any pain. His head felt dull and foggy, like the world around him was muffled. Though his vision was blurry, he arched his head and looked forward. Indistinguishable people stood, watching him with their phones out. To call for help or to film the scene, he wasn't sure. "Hey, buddy, you okay? Are you all right, sir?" "I've got an ambulance on the way." "Damn, did you see how many times he flipped?" An indecipherable amount of time passed, marked by fading moments of consciousness. Eventually, after an eternity, or perhaps mere minutes, an ambulance arrived at the scene. Jeremiah was hoisted up onto a gurney. 3 paramedics ran beside the gurney, checking Jeremiah's vitals and tending to any wounds they could. One of them began talking to Jeremiah. He was an older man, with a full head of white hair. He was rather tall, with a rigid stature. "Son, I need you to look at me. Can you give me some sort of sign that you're coherent?" Jeremiah gave him the finger. The man laughed and smiled. Good, good. I've got to tell you, son, that was one of the worst accidents I've seen. And I've been doing this job for almost 20 years now. Besides a pretty bad cut on your head, you came out of that with only a few scratches. Honestly, you should be dead. You've got to be feeling pretty lucky right about now, huh? Jeremiah didn't respond. He scanned the paramedic some more. His uniform differed from the others, and it appeared brand new. While the others wore navy blue uniforms, this man's uniform was black, and he didn't have a name tag. There were no patches indicating who he worked for or which hospital he might have been dispatched from. All he wore was a small golden pin. Though he wasn't sure, it appeared to be in the shape of a small frog or lizard. As Jeremiah was lifted into the ambulance, the paramedic leaned over, getting closer to Jeremiah. "I think someone was watching over you, young man," he whispered. Jeremiah reached for the oxygen mask strapped around his head and took it off, gripping it with his right hand. He looked directly into the paramedic's eyes. The man's friendly demeanor melted away when he saw the stern expression on Jeremiah's face. "Why did you save me?" Jeremiah said. The last thing I want is to see another day. Another piece of shit, me against the world day. Just leave me here. Jeremiah, weak, closed his eyes and let his head fall back. The paramedic stopped and stood speechless. Concern mounted in the man's eyes as the other two paramedics climbed in and shut the ambulance doors. Through the windows on the double doors, the man stayed locked on Jeremiah as the ambulance turned on its sirens and raced back down Expenditure. From his breast pocket, the man pulled out a small black radio.
This is Child 14 reporting from downtown. We need to initiate an extensive watch on Jeremiah Drake, effective immediately. I'll need at least a dozen team members to my location. And based on the information I received a few hours ago on Mrs. Drake, let's go ahead and get a delivery to Orcaseye General Hospital prepared just as a precaution. This one's pretty much a guarantee. Ascari, my only. I'll be patiently awaiting your arrival. As we serve.
Chapter 4. Jeremiah's eyes peeled open, revealing a dimly lit room. Nothing but bare white walls and silence, save for the muted telephones ringing from outside, a framed painting of an elderly man in a sailboat, and a steady pulsing blip coming from above. The sun peered through the tall blinds, and the air was annoyingly cold. He pulled the sheet closer to his face and reached for his forehead. A dull soreness expanded within his limbs with every move. He felt stitching, and traced his fingertips over the tiny grooves along his scalp. It wasn't just the tenderness in his muscles. He felt fatigued, almost as though he'd been drained of energy. The door to the room swung open. "Jeremiah, how you feeling?" Jeremiah groaned, staring at the ceiling. "Sore as hell. Who are you?" "I'll get to that in a minute. First, I need to know how your body's reacting to the medication. This is the first you've been awake since the accident." That voice. "I'm fine, just sore. Now, can you tell me who you are?" Jeremiah asked, still staring at the ceiling. "Jeremiah, it's me." Jeremiah paused and arched his head forward as much as he could. He saw a man standing in a white coat. He knew the voice sounded familiar. When he discovered who it was, he remembered that it was a voice he'd hoped to never hear again. "Dr. Stocks, why are you here?" The soreness was prominent, but now he felt more queasy than anything else. "Is Julianne here?" Jeremiah added. The blip remained steady. Jeremiah's head fell back on the pillow, his eyes fixed again on the ceiling. "She's here, Jeremiah. You'll get to see her in a few minutes, but please, you need to hear what I have to say." The room spun as Dr. Stocks kept talking. Jeremiah closed his eyes and concentrated on staying still. "Nothing I have to say is good news. I'm sure you gathered that by me being here. But I want you to know that there's hope." Jeremiah kept quiet. "Julianne's latest scans from this morning shocked us. The cancer that we had thought was in remission has apparently taken new life. At this point, chemo won't do anyone any favors. We have to perform the surgery if we want any chance for her to make it. And it has to be now." No response from Jeremiah. "You understand what I'm telling you, right?" Dr. Stocks added. Jeremiah lifted his trembling arm and pointed at the window. "Doctor, can you please open the window? I need some fresh air." After some hesitation, Dr. Stocks walked toward the window and pulled back the blinds. He unfastened the latch and pulled the window open a few inches. "Thank you." Dr. Stocks grew impatient. He knelt down by Jeremiah's bedside and altered his tone. "Jeremiah, you have to talk to your wife right now. We can't wait any longer. She's scheduled to go into surgery in 25 minutes. There's no guarantee at this point that you'll be able to talk with her afterwards. Please, I can't go into that room knowing you didn't at least have the chance to say goodbye to each other." Jeremiah stared out the window, past Dr. Stocks, over his head, through his being. Every word of his drifted into the ether without anything to latch onto. A royal blue Atlantic backdrop silhouetted the Orcaseye Skyline in the distance. Gumball-colored billboards stretched as far as the eye could see. The blip remained steady. Dr. Stalk stood up and exited through the door. His passionate inclination to persuade Jeremiah to see Julianne did little to convince him. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Not anymore. Jeremiah pulled back the stiff white comforter, ripped off his heart monitor, and placed his bare feet on the cold tile floor, struggling to stand. His inability to properly shift his weight caused his body to tip forward, but he had enough strength to stop himself by grabbing hold of the window ledge. Grunting as he pulled himself up, a soft breeze surprised him as his skin embraced the effulgence of the outside world. Jeremiah laughed to himself. Out of all days, today just had to be the most beautiful. Not a single rain cloud in sight. One last trip to the beach would have been nice, but that time had passed. Now, all there was left to do was drop. Balancing his naked feet on the narrow ledge, Jeremiah looked down. Crowds of shoppers flooded the sidewalk 8 stories below. The city was alive. It was loud, chaotic, a cacophony of consumerism. No one suspected a thing. No one on the street was prepared for what was about to happen. Jeremiah wondered if he'd be lucky enough to black out before even hitting the ground, but it didn't seem likely. He probably wasn't up high enough. Trying to get to the roof would be too much work. It wasn't worth trying to evade all the questions and resistance from hospital employees and Good Samaritans. And the last thing he wanted was to end up on the news for his parents to see, for his students to see. Regardless, he knew that jumping from here would get the job done. Julianne intercepted his focus as he shifted toward the Atlantic. Her smile, her eyes, oceans of blue. Everything that had been done to fight the cancer was nothing more than an apparent waste of time. And saying goodbye wasn't anything he wanted to do. Not anymore. He's made his peace with her. He had already revealed his truths. This world had become nothing but a burden. All passion had been erased. All compassion had been depleted. Saying goodbye had no weight to it, no meaning. He compared the feeling to his own existence, and with that thought, Jeremiah stuck his right leg over the ledge, over the blur of the crowded street below. A loud knock at the door startled him, and he recoiled his leg back inside of the window, grasping onto the wall with both hands. Jeremiah turned to face the inside of the hospital room, waiting for the door to open, but no one came in. Curiosity got the best of him as he kneeled on the ledge, bringing both of his feet back inside and onto the cold tile floor. He rushed back into bed and reattached his heart monitor, ready to act as if nothing had happened. After another knock, a few seconds passed before a mysterious man entered the room. He wasn't part of the hospital staff, being that he was covered in black from head to toe. His wardrobe rang familiar, however, when Jeremiah spotted a shiny pin on the breast pocket. It was just like the paramedics, gold and shaped like a small frog. The man had very broad shoulders and was easily over 6.5 feet tall. His muscular build was impressive for the man's age, who looked to be well into his 60s. He was carrying what looked to be some kind of helmet, black in color, reflective, with 2 alarmingly white, circular eyes. He sat the helmet at the foot of Jeremiah's bed and smiled. "Who are you?" Jeremiah asked, sitting up. "The name's Ascari, but you can call me Frank," the man replied. His voice was gentle, with a slight rasp. "Okay, what's with the outfit, Frank? And why are there so many other people wearing this creepy getup around town?" Frank laughed. I assume you're referring to the pin." "Actually, it's the black trench coat, but sure, that too." "I'm part of a pretty special group, Jeremiah." Jeremiah swallowed at the mention of his name. "And we've been keeping our eye on you for a while now, ever since Julianne had her initial diagnosis and you swallowed all those pills." Jeremiah's eyes widened. "Excuse me? How do you know about that?"
You've been prone to this kind of behavior since you were in your teens, and it seems to have resurfaced during the last couple of years. Let's just say, we've noticed." Jeremiah sat up slightly. "You need to explain what all of this is right now, or I'll pick up this phone and call the police." Jeremiah reached for the phone on the table by his bed, but the man showed no signs of trepidation. Jeremiah paused, and the man continued to speak. "We are the children of Anura. We possess the ability to sense those on the brink of ending their own lives, which allows us to monitor them more closely, giving us ample time to put a stop to the act itself, if it were to reach that point." Jeremiah sat speechless, waiting for further explanation. He withdrew his hand from reaching for the phone. "I'm here, Jeremiah, a part of this special group, all because of my family. My blood. The most important thing on this planet. My brother Josh and I, we have quite the history." Jeremiah listened attentively. "Both of us were unfortunate products of war. Always had been. When we were much younger, Josh and I had been drafted. We'd spent the majority of our early adult lives fighting along the shore of the South China Sea. But the biggest difference between our experiences is the fact that he had been captured by the enemy. Twice. Both times he was able to escape, thankfully. It was narrow, but he got out alive. The things he'd seen and endured are unexplainable, to say the least." Frank turned toward the window, pensive and solemn. "After we were called to come back home," Frank continued, "things were different. He hardly slept. He hardly ate. All he did was look out the window during the day with vacant eyes and scream at the top of his lungs as soon as he got the chance to fall asleep at night. He had been a prisoner of his own mind. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to accept. But at least, I always told myself, he was home." Jeremiah's expression didn't shift. The blip remained steady as Frank continued talking. "One night, I drove over to his apartment to check on him. Call it brother's intuition. I felt like I needed to see him. When I arrived, everything was silent. Nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to walk into. When I opened his bedroom door, I saw that he was hanging from a belt inside of his closet. The same vacant eyes looked back at me. The truth was, he never came back home at all. All I wanted to do was be with him. So I took my revolver and stuck it in my mouth. I pulled the trigger, but I'd forgotten that it wasn't loaded. Somehow I was able to find sleep, and the next morning I found this at the foot of my bed." Frank explained, looking down at the black helmet on Jeremiah's bed. "I was skeptical at first, but I couldn't help but wonder what it did, or where it came from. So I put it on. The experience was unlike anything I'd ever imagined." "What is it? What does it do?" Jeremiah asked. "To put it simply, it wakes you up. It gives you a taste of what it's like to be on the other side of your pain. It gives you the courage to push yourself past everything that's clouding your vision. Because the truth is, when you don't have anybody to pull you out of chaos, you need something more. This was my something more." Jeremiah lifted his body up and reached for the helmet, gripping it with both hands. The glowing white eyes stared back at him as he gradually fell back against the pillow. "Then, after I took it off, I felt something new," Frank continued. "I felt tremendous pain, but it wasn't my own. The pain was outside of my body, floating all around me. I could see it. It was the pain of others. I could see their thoughts. I could see what was creating the pain. And that's when I discovered my ability. My gift. That night, on my nightstand, I found this golden pin and this note," he said, handing Jeremiah a card. Jeremiah turned the card over in the palm of his hand. "In chaos, sensibility is fleeting. Anura has chosen you, as we serve." "This is something," Jeremiah said, tossing the card on the bed, looking back at the helmet in his lap, the condescension in his voice palpable. "So, what do you want me to do? Put this on or what?" "The choice is yours, Jeremiah." "Yes, exactly, because it's my life. You and your ridiculous cult have no right to come in and manipulate people with this terrifying contraption. If a person wants to take their own life, they have the autonomy to do so. If someone wants to live, they'll make the choice on their own." "If only it were that simple, Jeremiah. Some merely do not possess the strength to see outside of their own suffering, and that's why we exist. All children of Anura were once just like you. We all at one point were lost in our own chaos, ready to end it without taking another breath. Then Anura saved us, just as it will you. Let us save you. Allow yourself to be saved. Join us in our effort to remind the lost how precious life can be." Jeremiah shook his head, shifting his perspective once again toward the Orcaseye skyline through the open window. The blip remained steady. "Leave me alone. Please, tell your crew that they don't need to monitor me anymore. In a few minutes, there won't be anyone left to watch over. Sorry, but you failed." Frank hung at the edge of his bed for a moment, then turned to the door. "We'll be waiting," he said before exiting the room, "and so will those that need your guidance." A breeze rolled in from outside, and something caught Jeremiah's eye at the foot of the bed. He put the helmet to the side, reached forward, and grabbed the object in question. A golden pin, shaped like a frog. Turning the pin over between his thumb and index finger, Jeremiah pondered the idea of putting the helmet on. Was it true? Was it possible? If it were, what would it be like? What would it feel like? Regardless, it was wrong. Manipulation. Nothing short of a 21st century lobotomy. Despite his opposition, however, he continued to wrestle with curiosity. He stood up from the bed and walked toward the open window, setting the pin on the windowsill. Poking his head outside, he looked down at the herds of shoppers. Every single person on a different path, on a different journey, some perfectly content with their existences, others apathetic to the idea of what's to come, and many that were just like him, lost within their own chaos, as Frank had put it. The sound of the busy shoppers became eclipsed by the crashing Atlantic waves in the distance. Onto the windowsill, a butterfly landed, with translucent royal blue wings fluttering against the sun. Jeremiah locked eyes with it as it bobbed its body along the ledge, both wings folding perfectly against one another. Taken aback by its presence, Jeremiah walked backwards toward the bed and sat on the edge of the stiff mattress. The blip steadily grew more rapid. He ripped off the heart monitor and tossed it to the floor, looking back at the helmet as the room fell silent. Jeremiah locked onto the glowing abysses, held captive by the pulsing spirals of white. Chapter 5. The drowsiness was unshakable now, but that didn't stop Julianne from fighting to keep her eyes open. A dull haze crept along the corners of the room, and Julianne turned her head back toward the nurse. Her words were somber, shedding any resemblance of optimism with each passing syllable. She gripped the cold steel edges of the hospital bed. "Do you see him?" The nurse, watching through the window, appeared impatient and a little annoyed. "I don't think he's coming, Mrs. Drake." Moments later, her shoulders lifted. She turned back with a smile. "Never mind. Looks like he made it after all. I'll give you two a moment. Julianne saw Jeremiah peek through the door, and the nurse let him in. She only has a few minutes before we need to wheel her in, Mr. Drake. Okay. Thank you. Jeremiah turned to Julianne, slightly out of breath, and the door shut behind him. Better late than never, right? He said. His attempt at humor fell flat, to say the least. Julianne didn't know what to say. A single tear rolled down her cheek. It all felt like a terrible dream. He pulled up a stool and sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. To feel the warmth of his skin was just what she needed. Her bottom lip trembled. I can't believe I'm back here, she said, her words weakening. She felt him loosen his grip. He broke eye contact and he smirked, appearing lost in his own introspection. This was not the interaction she had envisioned. All she wanted were words of encouragement, words that allowed her to see that he believed in her strength, an indication of a desire to transfer some kind of positive energy, something that she could take with her into the next room, something she could hold on to, anything that she could place at the forefront of her mind to make her feel safe, to make her feel comforted and loved, to remind her of life's beauty, of life's potential, as the world around her blurred into nothingness. But such sentiments were illusory. All that existed was the emission of a sentence that hardened her heart, leaving it to sink like a stone in the sea. I can hardly believe it myself, Jeremiah said with a sigh. His focus remained on the empty space in front of him. His smirk returned as he met her eyes once more. We've both had a pretty tough day. With this utterance, Julianne's lips involuntarily peeled open and her eyes quickly veered away from his. Incredulity adhered to her ribs and rolled up her throat as his words slowly sank in. Jeremiah's lack of awareness regarding this counterfeit consolation almost caused her to laugh in disbelief, but that sensation was quickly replaced by a shudder of sorrow. There was no use in denying the reality of the situation any longer. The man at her bedside had become a ghost, a specter consumed by self-pity, blinded by a desperate need for validation. She allowed herself to wholly visualize all of this for the first time. As her mouth hung agape, Julianne's mind faded into a desolate white canvas, and the silence between the two grew immeasurable. Chapter 6. Vietnam, 1972.
Can you believe the lucky bastards working this job before us only had M16s?
Josh shouted over the whipping blades of the Huey.
No wonder the lifespan's only 5 minutes. That's an average, Josh.
Dan added from the pilot's seat. Frank kept quiet, shaking his head, focused on arming his weapon and readying his monkey harness. He prepared a belt of ammunition.
I can't imagine even attempting to do any of this bullshit without this thing,
Josh said, patting his weapon as if it were man's best friend while fastening the latch on his helmet. Still, Frank stayed silent. Dan adjusted his posture.
5 minutes till we open the doors, boys.
The beach of the South China Sea became visible in the distance. The sunlight flooded the cabin window, and the air was stifling.
Strap yourself in, Josh. It's time to make our new boy back home good and proud.
After loading the M60's ammunition, Frank readied a bungee cord.
Nah, I don't need to make anyone proud, especially him. He's the only reason I'm here anyway, thanks to this lottery from hell.
Frank's eyes fixed on Josh's as he grabbed him by the harness.
Hey, listen to me,
Frank demanded.
We've got a job to do. We have to stick together. And we're coming out on top, so pay attention so you don't get yourself killed.
Josh laughed.
How many times do I have to tell you that this is different, bro?
He said, pushing Frank's arm away.
This isn't 1945 and we ain't no picture-perfect heroes. We're gunners in a war we shouldn't even be fighting. I don't get how we're still alive doing this shit, man.
Frank took off his helmet and wiped the sweat off his brow. I'll tell you why. We're here to prove a point. and we're not going out until we do. Josh removed his helmet as well. Well, yeah? What are we trying to prove, that gunners ain't goners? Because each time we slide open that door, I know one of these bastards is going to get me right between the eyes. It's coming sooner than later. Don't act like you don't know that. Not for us. Not for what we're protecting. They're the enemy, and we have to stop them. That's our job, as brothers. Josh shook his head. God damn, you think they're the enemy? You know, sometimes I wonder how I was even born into this shit. Neither of us is supposed to be here, me especially. Yes, we are. We have a duty, Josh. A role. You can't let your misguided opinions get in the way of that, Frank explained. We're here to perpetuate our prominence, to show these bastards their place. Misguided? No, you act like we're back fighting the Nazis or something. Now those fools needed to be put in their place. Dad had a purpose. This is some territorial shit that don't involve us. We're only here because we were forced to be. I mean, I tried starving myself to get out of this shit. What does that tell you? And to be honest, I'd rather die here now than go back home to only get put back on another Huey and be forced to do this crap again in some other shithole country. Or even worse, to be left alone with the memory of all this. Frank sat back. You tried to starve yourself? He asked, incredulous. Josh hesitated. Yeah, Frankie, I tried everything. Didn't have enough money saved for a trip north, and I wasn't about to enroll into college. Everyone knows I'm too much of a dumb shit to pull that off. Frank shot Josh a look of disappointment. I know you tried to burn your draft card, but I had no idea you were depriving yourself of food. Is that why you always took your dinner plate to your room? Josh laughed. Shut the hell up, man. I'll do whatever the hell I want. And yeah, I did try to burn my draft card. So what? Why does it matter so much to you? You know how I feel about all of this. It's an imprisonable offense, Josh. We don't break the law in this family. The smile on Josh's face was immovable. You've got to be kidding me. Prison? War? What's the difference? You're dead either way. At least in prison I'd have the safety of good old red, white, and blue metal bars. Funny thing is, this is prison. This metal around me now will probably kill me, he concluded, laughing again, mutating into a manic cackling. He calmed a bit and paused with an agape, sardonic smile. We're engaged, Frankie! Josh batted at the helicopter door in a frenzy, and Dan turned as if to stop him. Frank shook his head. And Mom sure as hell doesn't deserve any of this. All she does is wait. Every day she waits, looking out the kitchen window for the news. God needs to get this shit over with so I can stop worrying about her, Josh continued after collecting himself. Frank, bemused, wanting nothing more than for Josh to understand. At the looks of it, there was likely no getting through to him. But that wasn't going to stop him from trying. We represent an entire country, Josh. An entire ideal of hope and liberty. That's what we're fighting for. Do you realize that? So that we can go back home and live the lives we want for ourselves and for Mom.
60 seconds,
Dan instructed. Josh stumbled for a second, struggling to form a response. There's something you don't understand, Frankie. We're a family without hope. War? That's all we know. Grandpa, Dad, his pop, you and me. Look at us. Look at this family. All we do is fight and die. And how many more are out there dying just like you and me? How many more families are ripped apart by fighting, by all this chaos? Frankie, this isn't liberty. It's hell. Actual hell. And we'll never have these lives you say we want for ourselves because of it. We can never return to normal after something like this. There ain't nothing out there that can cure that. Frank paused and looked out at the beach, drawing nearer through the cabin window. The rising waves flashed and shimmered against the sunlight like a bouquet of flames reaching for land or the sky above it. The air enveloped him with a swathe of humidity, and he tried to swallow. He turned back and placed his hand on Josh's shoulder. You just remember to do your job, Josh. Josh pushed Frank's hand away. Yeah, and you remember to do yours. Stay the hell out of my way. Josh strapped his helmet and fastened his harness. Frank did the same. After Frank connected the bungee cord to his M60, he repositioned, gripped the door handle, and waited for further orders from Dan, turning back to Josh. Josh noticed Frank looking in his direction.
Turn around and get ready, Frankie. I know what I'm doing. I don't need your eyes on me.
Frank, sullen, slowly turned to face the cabin.
Get ready to open up and open fire, boys. Looks like some Charlie want to play.
Dan said as he pointed toward an area of thicket showing movement.
Hey, Frankie.
Frank, unsure if he was only hearing things, turned back toward Josh.
You got Daddy's bullet?
Frank patted the front pocket of his uniform with a confident smile.
Right here, brother. Time to play some leapfrog.
Josh flashed Frank a thumbs up, then positioned himself at the M60. Frank did the same. He gripped the trigger, and Dan gave the signal.
Light 'em up.
The doors were thrown open, and the brothers opened fire on the thicket below. Bodies dropped to the grass, one after the other. Bullets ricocheted off the Huey, and Frank threw Dan a signal instructing him to fall back.
There's too many of them. Get us to the other side.
Dan, through several jerking motions, maneuvered the Huey over the jungle to camouflage their flight pattern behind the trees. Now both Frank and Josh had the opportunity to take out as many Viet Cong as possible while reducing their vulnerability to gunfire. The Huey whipped overhead. Casualties climbed as more VC emerged from the undergrowth, multiplying and scattering through the shrubbery like cockroaches, their weapons aimed skyward. The brothers remained unscathed as they continued to fire upon the VC beneath them. A whir of bullets was the only sound heard amidst the Huey's chopping blades, along with the penetrating cries of consternation from the wounded in the grass below, a cacophony of artillery and agony. Blood splashed over Frank's face. He looked up. Dan was unresponsive, slumped over in his seat with a bullet wound to the temple.
Dan!
Blood hastily spilled from the wound, and the Huey descended toward the jungle, plummeting with dizzying gyration. Frank gripped the base of his M60 and looked over at Josh's post as the Huey continued to spin, but there was no sign of him. On the verge of vomiting, Frank closed his eyes and screamed in an attempt to forget about the nauseating sensation crawling up his throat. Gravity, for a moment, felt non-existent as the spinning felt more like floating. As the grass below quickly approached Frank's field of view through the helicopter door, he leapt from the Huey, narrowly escaping before the moment of impact. Frank plunged toward the thicket, landing head first, and his surroundings suddenly appeared as though he were tumbling inside of a kaleidoscope. Blackness spread across the sky, the sound of an explosion faded in the distance, and as the darkness encompassed his field of view, Frank slowly slipped out of consciousness. Chapter 7. Orcaseye. Present day. Sitting alone in his father's station wagon, parked in a small suburban neighborhood just outside of the city, Jeremiah heaved a sigh, removed his tie, and tossed it in the back seat. The conversation he just had with Julianne was painful. Necessary, but painful. Never in 1,000 years did he think he'd lose her. Yes, it was her choice to walk away, but a choice that Jeremiah had to learn to accept. There were so many things he had said that he wished he could take back, but it was no use walking through his regrets yet again. That moment they'd shared before she was wheeled into surgery was all she needed to make her decision. It was true. Just as she had told him during their last fight in the kitchen, in that moment, he was not the man she married. There was no "I love you." There wasn't even a slight glance of endearment. His own words reverberated through his mind. "I don't give a shit. I just want to be left the hell alone." Though the words might have felt genuine at the time, it couldn't have been further from the truth. He was lost, in disarray, out of sorts, not himself. Whatever excuse he could think of, it wasn't enough to justify any of the things he had said to her. But there was a kind of grace he pulled from that argument, something he'd mentioned to her before he left. He'd admired the passion in her heart, even if that passion was fueled by indignation toward him. She was the kind of woman he'd always dreamed of being with. The strong kind. The kind that never let anything get in the way of her ambition. But most of all, the kind with enough compassion to make a man transform himself. He always cherished the love they had built together. and somewhere in the recesses of his heart, he hoped that Julianne recognized his pain as merely a phase in time, a blip in reality that pulled him away from sensibility and reason, a passing wave of looming strife that would give way to a calming current, leading to the bank of a stream where he could pause, look into himself, and rediscover that adoration for life he had abandoned along the way. He had become a stranger in his own home, distracted by the superfluous, by the pursuit of greed, and blind to the idea of celebrating the wonderful victories that had come his way. But under the surface, he knew it had all stemmed from a birthplace of altruism, mutated by the combination of misguided self-righteousness and the debilitating need for recognition, for acceptance and acknowledgement not only from others, but from himself. Jeremiah knew he'd find himself someday. That was something he could accept. That sentiment alone was enough to warrant the separation from Julianne. And if he were to find himself lucky enough to be with her again, he would do anything in his power to maintain order. Jeremiah pulled the golden necklace from his shirt pocket, Julianne's favorite. He never asked her if he could keep it. He took it out when the doctor gave him her belongings once she came out of surgery. Jeremiah never bothered to tell her. Sitting in the driver's seat, he traced his fingers along the necklace, across the white pearls, leading to the golden butterfly that dangled from the latch at the end. He laid the necklace atop the dashboard and reached into his pocket once more. From it, he removed Frank's golden pin. From across the street, coming from what sounded like the inside of a home, someone was shouting,
"Shut my door! I'm not on drugs, okay? Just leave me the hell alone!"
A door slammed, and Jeremiah, with the pin in hand, shifted his focus to the open window across the street. Sitting on his bed with his backpack, Connor wiped the tears from his eyes. He unzipped his backpack and pulled out a small silver tin. Jeremiah monitored Connor from the driver's seat, leaning back to avoid being seen. Connor rolled up the sleeve of his shirt, revealing a mulberry abscess on his forearm. Connor opened the tin, removed a syringe, shut the window, and closed the blinds. Jeremiah closed his eyes, turned forward, and his gut sank. When he opened them, he saw Julianne's necklace glimmering against the sun. He glanced back at the golden pin in his hand and placed it beside the necklace on the dash. Both items gleamed before him, each possessing a particular notion of significance, neither of which he could properly prioritize. Memories of Connor flooded his mind. On the first day of his sophomore year, Connor could not stop complimenting Jeremiah's classroom. The superhero posters, the movie posters, the artwork. Connor loved it all, and was a fan of Jeremiah since day one, and vice versa. Connor was always the happy kid, always volunteering in class, always showing off his artistic skills, and that smile. It was unforgettable, contagious. He was a straight A student with a great deal of compassion and an open mind, the kind of kid an educator hoped all of their students would turn out to be. Then, his junior year came around, and everything changed, just as it had for Jeremiah. Almost simultaneously, Connor's parents divorced, and Julianne was diagnosed with lung cancer. And here they both were, on the other side of heartache, still caught in the tangles of chaos, lost in the darkness, where sensibility is fleeting. Frank's words echoed within Jeremiah's bones as he turned back to the black helmet sitting in the back seat, taunting him, just as it did at the foot of his hospital bed days before. The glowing white eyes beckoned him.
"It wakes you up. It gives you a taste of what it's like to be on the other side of your pain. It gives you the courage to push yourself past everything that's clouding your vision. Because the truth is, when you don't have anybody to pull you out of chaos, you need something more."
With a turn of the key, Jeremiah shut off the car.
"Join us in our effort to remind the lost how precious life can be."
He reached for the dash, lingered between the necklace and the pin, and Julianne's words intercepted his focus. Apparently, all you'd rather do is die alone in this awful place we've built together. I really hope you can find something that gives you the strength to help push yourself past this, because you are not the man I married. Jeremiah exited the station wagon, making his way toward Connor's home, the gold in his hand sparkling in the sunlight. Chapter 8. Vietnam, 1972. Lying in the undergrowth, Frank opened his eyes and caught his breath, jarred awake by an explosion erupting in the distance and a violent undulation traversing beneath him. Murderers of crows abandoned the treetops and escaped into the ocean of a perfect blue sky above. After realizing he had survived the impact, Frank reached for his revolver as he turned over onto his stomach. He opened the cylinder, assuring that the chamber was fully loaded. "Make them count," he said under his breath as he crawled out of the thicket and onto the grass. Fragments of the Huey were sprinkled throughout the jungle, crackling with fire. His senses on high alert, Frank's eyes darted toward every possible direction in search for more VC as he scuttled over the grass, attempting to remain in the shadows of the undergrowth. He paused behind a bush, rubbing his elbows. The jungle was eerily quiet. No footsteps, no gunfire, no commotion of any kind. All that lingered was the deteriorating smoke from the crash, which would inevitably draw attention this way at some point or another. He rolled up the sleeves to his uniform and readied his revolver. As he crawled forward, the faint sound of a man's voice presented itself in the distance. Though no words were discernible, the man sounded as if he was in tremendous pain. Frank decreased the speed of his crawl, advancing toward the voice with extreme caution. With his revolver out in front of him, the man's voice became comprehensible among other voices.
Please, oh God, don't do this. No, you son of a bitch.
Shut up. The man's voice instantly transformed into a manic moaning, desperate for mercy. The crunching sound of what could only be bone was then followed by a muffled scream, as if the man's mouth was being forcibly stuffed with cloth or leaves, possibly mud. A wave of panic washed over Frank's entire being. The tortured voice. It can't be. His crawling unfolded into a clumsy attempt to stand up and run as he staggered toward what he believed to be his brother's voice. His boots slammed against the ground beneath him as he sprinted forward. As he ran, a subdued, blood-curdling scream penetrated the sky, and his legs moved faster than his mind. He tripped over his own feet, losing the grip on his revolver as he tumbled to the ground, tossing it through the air. As he hit the dirt, a gunshot echoed in the distance. "No," he whispered to himself. After analyzing the sound of the round, there was no way it could have come from any Viet Cong, being that they were likely all carrying M16s. Frank sighed. Damn, it went off. Wasted bullet. Before he attempted to push his body up from the dirt with his hands, someone grabbed him by his hair and forcibly pulled his body upward. In his field of view stood two VC, both with M16s drawn, pointed directly at his head. Behind them was Josh, with his own sock stuffed into his mouth. Watching his motionless body for about 10 long seconds, there was no other conclusion to be drawn but the obvious. Josh was dead. Sons of bitches. Another VC walked toward Frank, wiping the sweat off his brow with Josh's other sock. Signs of life. Josh coughed and struggled to turn himself onto his back. Thank God. Frank, visually distressed, conscious of his trembling lip, stayed upright, swallowed, and locked eyes with the VC walking his way. You piece of shit, I'm going to tear your goddamn heart out. I swear I'll... Frank took an uppercut to the chin just before the backs of his legs were struck with the butt of a rifle held by another standing behind him, forcing him onto his knees. After 2 blows to the face, Frank's head was held down as his hands were tied behind his back with rope.
You, brother, the VC declared. With his head down, Frank could see the VC now holding a bloody hunting knife. With the sock, he wiped it clean of what was most likely Josh's blood. Frank remained still on his knees as the VC behind him pulled his hair back, presenting Frank's neck to the other in front of him. Your brother, coward, the VC added, ripping the dog tags from Frank's neck as he stared into his eyes. Ascari, Franklin. America. Cowards. Frank cocked his head backward and spit in the VC's face. You watch your goddamn mouth. Without breaking eye contact, the VC laughed in response, still holding Josh's sock, now using it to wipe the spit off his face. You laugh now, Frank said with a deep grumble in his voice. But you have no idea what's coming. Tell your children, my people will show you your place in this world, your role. You take my family, I take yours. The VC gripped Frank by the neck, forcing the sock into his mouth, pushing it to the back of his throat. The cold steel of the hunting knife pressed against Frank's neck, and despite having the bloody sock lodged in his mouth, he instinctively attempted to swallow as the VC gently dragged the tip of the blade along his Adam's apple. Frank glanced over at Josh, saw that his face was quickly losing color, and discovered several stab wounds along his abdomen. Looked like 6, possibly more. Memories of their childhood together flashed before his mind's eye as he caught his own reflection in the silver blade. From the moment Josh was born, Frank had found the companion he'd been waiting for. Someone to share the world with. He could remember like it was yesterday. He couldn't wait for Josh to get out of his mother's belly. He always knew, somehow, some way, they'd end up together, as brothers, working together, fighting together, dying together. Frank had spent the better part of the last 3 years trying to make sense of the disconnect that had been lodged between them, trying to patch it back together. What was it that caused them to grow so distant from each other? It was as if one day Josh couldn't stand to be part of the family anymore. But he knew. Josh hated the idea of war. He detested the very mention of the word from anyone in the family. Once he was old enough to learn the truth about what had happened to their father, the thought of war had become unfathomable to him, unforgivable. He always used to ask how one man could possibly possess the desire to take on the entire world, attempt to exterminate all of those he considered unfit or unacceptable, and get away with it for so long, with so many advocates under his wing. He simply didn't want to accept the fact that certain capacities could exist in a man. As kids, Frank had always found ways to teach Josh of the positives to war, the benefits of such fighting, such suffering, the necessity of being involved with a movement to bring down a man with such capacity. It always came back to pride, to one's reputation, loyalty, and stature. Frank would always say, "We've overcome economic hardship and won every war, and all this happened during this century. We showed our dominance as a worldwide superpower, and now we're both feared and respected by all. Nobody is ever going to even think about replicating what that man did. What happened to Dad will never happen to us." As he grew older, Frank had clung to this thought day in and day out, becoming a staunch nationalist like his father and his father before him. Knowing he had lived in a country with such a rich history, and had had a father so courageous to have sacrificed himself to keep its ideals thriving, Frank could only dream of becoming a man as brave as his father, only, unlike him, able to one day board the plane back home as a victor, to witness his people cheering in the streets upon arrival, to come back home and celebrate with his wife and children. Josh, however, didn't see it that way. Josh always argued that their father didn't sacrifice himself for anyone, or anything. Josh believed that their father more than likely took his own life to escape the war, to finally be free of the shackles of chaos. There was no evidence to prove either side of the story, but there was no way Frank was going to believe that his father decided to take the coward's way out.
There was no way he could envision his father making the choice to abandon his family in such a way. He was stronger than that, bigger than that, a hero, a war hero. It was the only version of his father his mind was willing to accept. But now, a certain possession of acrimony haunted Frank, hanging off his back as he stood before his brother, with nothing but questions. Why this? Why not pride? Why wasn't that what he felt while looking down at his beloved brother? What was this sudden surge of dread, of disillusionment? With imminent death at his throat, bound and gagged, Frank made a promise to himself. "We're getting out of this," Frank thought as the blade glided across his skin. "You and me, brother. We've got lives to lead. Together." Chapter 9. Orcaseye. Present day. The man with the golden pin was sitting 4 rows up, which was 1 row closer to them than before. Jeremiah had noticed him immediately when they had walked in to join the meeting. The black uniform, the unsettling demeanor. Jeremiah couldn't stand the fact that he kept showing up. He tried to find them a different spot, further away from the man, but since they were 15 minutes late, there were only so many empty seats available for Jeremiah and Connor to be able to sit next to each other. This was the 5th consecutive time that they were late, and Jeremiah discovered that he'd run out of ways to lecture Connor about the importance of being punctual to these meetings, about the necessity and the reward of coming out alive on the other side of chaos and hopelessness. It probably didn't even matter anyway, being that all Connor did at these things was sit with his arms crossed, head snapped back over the chair, tongue hanging out, and a blank stare that could redefine apathy. Jeremiah had envisioned all of this much differently. He knew for a fact that Connor would connect with all of the other drug addicts, share his stories, become enlightened, maybe even make a friend or two, and he would come out a changed kid with a new head on his shoulders, a new outlook. How could he not? Connor's personality was contagious, but, truthfully, he couldn't care less. Jeremiah had forgotten how closed off Connor was around strangers. He was the same way in class for about a month when Jeremiah had first met him. It's like he'd stepped back in time. The kid didn't even take out his sketch pad anymore to pass the time. Then Jeremiah remembered. That was the subject of his first lecture. To pay attention, be respectful, and not allow any distractions. He was surprised Connor even continued to follow that rule of his. Or did he? Maybe he just didn't care anymore about that either. Signs pointed to the latter. As usual, the audience was in the middle of sharing their experiences with addiction with the rest of the attendees, and Jeremiah kept his eyes on the man from Anura. It was the same guy every meeting. The infiltrator. He never talked, and every minute or so he'd turn back to look at Connor, like he was keeping tabs on him. The man was considerably younger than Frank, perhaps in his early 40s. He had that pursed look that an annoying dad has when he's waiting for his son to do something wrong just so he could scold him in front of everyone, to show off as the guy that doesn't take shit from anybody. In reality, Jeremiah knew what this guy would actually try to do if Connor ever decided to take drastic measures. But hell would freeze over before anyone would dare to attempt to bring that helmet anywhere near him. There were no discernible markings on the man's face or body from what Jeremiah could see. Every time he spotted one of them in public, it was what he looked for first. Scars, burns, old gunshot wounds. After coming across the woman in the parking lot at work with the wicked scar along her neck, he couldn't help but want to know how each of these people had tried to attempt suicide to begin with. It was so fascinating to ponder all of the methods suicidal people had thought of to try to kill themselves. Why would she want to do something as painful as slitting her own throat? If that's what her plan actually was anyway. But what else could it be? She couldn't get a scar like that from trying to hang herself. Even that seemed like too much. If someone truly wanted to end it, wouldn't they want it to be quick? Painless? With that question, Jeremiah remembered his method of choice 9 months ago. The memory of the Orcaseye Skyline atop the Atlantic waves flashed across his eyes. From what he could tell, it was sure to be both quick and painless. It had to be. Jumping from that far up, there was no way it wouldn't have been instant. The thought created a knot in his stomach and he swallowed. Thank God Frank had knocked. As the proverbial conch shell came their way, it was time once again for Connor to seize the opportunity to take the floor and share his experiences for the first time. But Jeremiah feared he'd just mutter that same deflating utterance once it was his turn to speak. And as the time came, unfortunately, Jeremiah was proven right yet again. Pass. It became exponentially more disheartening with the passing of each meeting. And with each meeting, it was clear that Jeremiah had to come to terms with the truth. These meetings weren't doing shit. He had to find another way to get through to Connor. Another way to prove to him that things could get better. Walking back to the car, Connor kept his head down and slid his hands into his coat pockets. A puff of air climbed upward as Jeremiah sighed into the frigid December night. The crowd of about 30 or so had more of a jovial feeling than usual as they dispersed throughout the parking lot. A lot of attendees received their 12-month tokens tonight. Jeremiah turned back and smiled as he watched dozens of hugs and other congratulatory gestures bloom across the asphalt. His smile gradually lost its fervor, and a bittersweet jealousy washed over his bones as he envisioned himself with Connor in the same manner. Connor was waiting patiently by the passenger door. "I don't want to get anything to eat tonight. Just drop me off at home, Mr. Drake." Connor stared at his feet as he made his demands, every word immersed in enervated defeat. It was a tradition for the two to grab a bite after each meeting. If he were being honest with himself, Jeremiah didn't have much of an appetite either. Connor was more islanded than usual. It was unlikely they'd develop any kind of meaningful conversation, and the last thing Jeremiah wanted to do was waste $15 on what would inevitably become a soggy, untouched BLT. But the last thing he wanted to do was leave Connor alone and out of his sight. All he could think about was the man from Anura. He didn't see where he had left once the meeting ended, but he wasn't monitoring him closely anyway. He probably should have been. His sense of alertness heightened. Something about the night air suddenly felt stifling. Jeremiah unlocked the doors to his station wagon and got in. "Yeah, I'm not that hungry myself. Let's get you home." Jeremiah didn't want to badger Connor with any questions at the risk of distancing himself even further. He started the car, reversed from the stall, then exited the church parking lot, making a left onto Expenditure. Was he upset with Connor? Of course. These meetings were meant to help him, and they definitely would if he would just give himself the chance to open up and allow the darkness inside to escape and be known. Jeremiah didn't have any children of his own, and for the last few months he'd been blaming his inability to help Connor on that fact alone. He wasn't a real dad. But anytime he'd dredge up this argument with himself, Julianne's voice resounded in his mind with an immediate retort. "You're going to make an amazing father for our children one day. It's who you're meant to be." That was a long time ago. Before he could realize, Jeremiah had arrived at Connor's street. The bright strings of red and green Christmas lights gleamed past his window, and a bit of fog had settled atop the frosty lawns. Besides a weathered wreath and some sporadic tinsel on the doorframe, Connor's home was devoid of spirit. Plus, it was the only home without the porch light on, which meant Connor's father was likely out drinking again, and probably wouldn't be home until sunrise, which meant Jeremiah would more than likely have to pick him up for school yet again. Thankfully, tomorrow is the last day before Christmas break. A rush of winter air permeated the inside of the car and the passenger door slammed shut. Connor was already halfway up the driveway before Jeremiah could even put the car in park and bring the window down. "Connor!" he shouted. Connor stopped, but didn't turn around to face him. Jeremiah brought his voice down, comforting, patient. "We're gonna find a way to get through this, man. I know these meetings aren't your thing. I can see that now. We won't go to another one, at least for a while. I promise. but we have to keep working on this. I'll find another way. Connor remained motionless in the driveway, silent, hunched over a wilting shadow. Jeremiah scoured his mind for the right thing to say, but it seemed as if every word would fall on deaf ears, no matter how poignant, relevant, or necessary. A slot machine of phrases and cliches scrolled across his eyelids, but here and now, it felt best to stick with a timeless classic. One that resonated with anybody drowning in despair, one that made a human being recall that sense of belonging, and for a fleeting moment forget the haunting enmity, the alienation, and the all-consuming parasitic notion that in this plane of existence you've overstayed your welcome. I love you, buddy. Remember that. You're so important to me. Connor turned his head, but never made eye contact. He responded with only a hint of a nod and continued toward the front porch. Jeremiah stayed parked until he saw Connor walk inside of his home, and the night smothered him like a dense blanket of snow. He glanced at the rearview mirror for a moment and made a U-turn. As Connor's home shrank away in the center of the reflection, Jeremiah caught himself slowing down. He couldn't shake the nervousness that crawled across his shoulders. Sitting at the stop sign at the end of the street, his knuckles burning white on the steering wheel, the desire to turn back gnawed at his fingertips. For the past few months, it was safe to say that Connor had been embarrassed, to say the least, by the fact that Jeremiah had found out about the heroin. As anyone might become after such an incident, Connor transformed into something of a recluse. Quiet in class, often late, always the first to leave. A ghost at lunchtime. An anomaly once the dismissal bell echoed across campus at the end of the day. Somehow the entire school had found out, which continued to bewilder Jeremiah. He hadn't said a word to anyone. It wasn't much of a surprise to him, however. Secrets and rumors tended to possess a mind of their own and infiltrate the ether of Orcaseye High School. Regardless, once word got out, Connor had lost that light in his eyes. That contagious smile. This wasn't the first time Jeremiah had dropped him off in such a sullen state, but this was different. Tonight, the light in his eyes had morphed into a darkness all too familiar. A darkness that spread. A darkness that would not stop until it wholly consumed. To a point when it felt as if life couldn't deal a lower blow. Jeremiah wiped a tear from his cheek and pulled the steering wheel with a mighty grip. Careening, the winterland backdrop of the neighborhood swiveling like a carousel, he drove back toward Connor's home and parked across the street. The heat evaporated as soon as he turned and removed the key. Hours went by, and Jeremiah was harboring a restless need to get out and talk to Connor. Being that it was past midnight and his father could return home in a drunken stupor at any moment, he decided to avoid the possibility of a colossal miscalculation and stay in the car to wait, unsure of what he was waiting for at all. All that mattered was that he was there, able to keep an eye on him. Minutes later, a light came on inside of Connor's home. It was difficult to see through the closed drapes in the front window, but within the sheer fabric, Jeremiah could make out Connor's silhouette. He might have been standing in a bathroom or maybe a closet, but the light went out before he could discern any other details. The bottom line was that Connor was still awake, and this left Jeremiah unsettled for some reason. Of course, many if not all teenagers stayed up late on school nights, but the night's circumstances gave him reason to be suspicious, unnerved, scared. A pair of headlights shone on the icy asphalt next to him. Jeremiah sunk in the driver's seat as the yellow glow grew until only his eyes remained leering over the open window. The car, black, shaped like a small sphere, with heavily tinted windows on all sides, pulled into Connor's driveway and sat. There were no license plates. The brake lights illuminated the driveway a bright candy apple red, accompanying the holiday motif of the neighborhood. The engine hummed, and Jeremiah continued analyzing the mysterious automobile. There was no way this was Connor's father. The car was entirely too pristine and unlike any vehicle he'd ever seen. Perhaps he was responsible enough to call for a ride? Unlikely. Jeremiah kept his eyes glued to the automobile. The engine remained rumbling when the man stepped out from the driver's side. The same man from the meeting. The man from Anura. And in his hands, the black helmet. The glowing white eyes. The man shut the door and walked towards Connor's front porch, and Jeremiah stepped out of the station wagon. "No, that's not happening here," Jeremiah shouted. "Get back in the car." His shoes scraped the street as he charged toward the driveway, pointing his finger at the man. Jarred by Jeremiah's presence, the man's expression transformed from worried to something resembling playful satisfaction. He smiled. The golden pin on his uniform reflected the surrounding Christmas lights. Jeremiah stopped at the edge of the gutter. "Get that goddamn thing out of here and away from him. He doesn't need it. He doesn't need you." The man paused, then took 4 steps toward Jeremiah.
You have no idea what this boy needs. That's been made obvious tonight, Mr. Drake. We've given you a chance. Now the children of Anura must intervene.
Jeremiah wanted to step up, rip the helmet from his arms, and smash it on the street. But he refrained. "No, I'm not done. I can help him. I just need another way. So you tell Frank to just leave him alone. I need more time." The man stayed quiet on the sidewalk. Jeremiah took another step onto the curb. "Take that damn helmet and get the hell out of here. You are not going to manipulate that boy in any way. You understand me? I am keeping him in my sights until this is all over. And if I ever catch you or Frank or anybody else trying this shit again, I'll..." Jeremiah detected the dramatic, hyperbolic nature of what was about to come out of his mouth, and he stopped. Did he mean what he was about to say? It was difficult to tell in the moment, but if anything, it proved how much he did in fact want to help Connor. And now in this brief hiatus, it proved that the moment no longer had power over him. When he'd told Connor he loved him, it wasn't just a means to end a conversation or run and hide from inner turmoil. It was genuine, a moment of truth between 2 people, built from truth, delivered from truth. Being someone who's worked so hard to shift his focus to speaking only when words of validity and truth were necessary, Jeremiah had learned to recognize the importance of establishing a balance between emotion and rationality when conveying one's disdain, one's hatred and disgust, for the mind's power over the body could potentially lead to unwarranted, subconscious tragedy. The driveway became the abyss below the hospital window, with a vision of Julianne looking up from the void, and Jeremiah caught his breath. He stepped down and back from the curb, and the darkness faded. The Christmas lights returned. All passion and anger receded from his voice. "Just stay away from him. You hear me? Stay away." Jeremiah, after sustaining eye contact for a moment to punctuate the seriousness of his statement, turned back to his car. The silence in the air was interrupted by a voice on a small black radio pinned to the lapel of the man's uniform. Jeremiah started the car and drove away from Connor's home.
"Child 26, return home. Give Drake what he asks for. I'll take care of this test myself."
Yes, Ascari, as we serve.
Chapter 10. Vietnam, 1972. Josh was looking right back at Frank as if he could hear everything in his head. All fear had receded from his eyes. As the blade pierced his skin, a flash of light flickered over Frank's right eye. Lodged inside of a bush, an unidentifiable object was reflecting the sunlight back his way. Frank's unfocused and fluctuating eye contact with the VC in front of him caught the attention of the other 2 standing guard in front of Josh, who then looked toward the same area. One of them, with his M16 still drawn, took a walk toward the general direction where Frank was looking. As his back blocked the direction of the sunlight, casting a shadow, Frank was able to see the object in question hidden in the shrubbery. His revolver. The second walked over as well. With both armed VC distracted, this was the best opportunity to escape. Frank spit out the sock, and with as much force as possible, tore through the rope with one quick motion. His wrists burned like hell. Using the heel of his boot, he stomped on the right knee of the VC standing behind him, and headbutted the other in front of him. The one behind him collapsed with a boisterous groan, gripping his knee, while the other ran off, heading deeper into the jungle. Leaping forward, pulling a knife from a compartment on his thigh as he somersaulted, Frank stopped and wrapped his hand around the mouth of one of the armed VC, stabbing him in the heart, feeling the force of the blade push through his chest. He then gripped him by his shoulders, using his body as a shield. His shouting was immediately silenced as bullets shred through his abdomen, blood spattering onto Frank's arms and uniform. The second VC fired 5 more shots, though only one of them pierced Frank's left leg as he attempted to reach for his revolver. Frank groaned in pain as he tossed the lifeless body to the ground. Another bullet collided with the dirt just over his head as he pulled the revolver out from under the shrub, turned over, and fired. With a single shot to the forehead and a brief spray of crimson, the VC dropped onto his back. Knowing the VC he had headbutted would probably come back, Frank remained on the ground with his revolver drawn. The other that had pushed and pulled him by the hair continued to writhe in pain over his broken knee. Frank watched him carefully while remaining attentive to the rest of his surroundings. The wounded VC reached into a pocket on his uniform. Son of a bitch, Frank thought. With a shot to the temple, Frank killed him before knowing exactly what he had been reaching for. Once again, as the smoke cleared, the jungle became strangely quiet. The man that had nearly killed his brother was still alive, and likely still in the area.
Josh, you with me?
I'm here, Josh said from behind the shrubbery, each word sounding more brittle than the last.
You stay where you are. You're losing blood fast, so you need to save your energy. Try to apply pressure to the wounds.
Frank, looking at his own wounded leg, set the revolver down in the grass and ripped the left sleeve off his uniform, wrapping it tightly to prevent further bleeding. After tending to his injury, he got back down, picked up the revolver, and opened the cylinder. The sun gleamed against the silver casting as he held it up to the sky. As his eyes fixed upon the remaining bullets, he contemplated for a moment. His arms locked, and the image of the VC that had stabbed Josh flashed in his mind. His brother's screams resonated within his bones. They wouldn't stop. The silhouette of an open cylinder cast upon Frank's chest as he opened the revolver, emptying each loaded chamber one by one, admiring its rotation, gradual and heavy, like an abandoned Ferris wheel. He tossed the remaining bullets in the thicket behind him. Closing the cylinder, he placed the revolver back in its holster and stared up at the cloudless sky, allowing the time for his body to regain the energy to walk.
I need you to stay as quiet as possible, Josh. You're gonna be just fine.
Just at that moment, footsteps, about 10 meters to the right.
Shit, don't make a sound.
Trying to withhold from making any noise whatsoever, Frank kept still on his back, listening as the sound of crunching blades of grass drew nearer with each passing second. Silence now. He remained still.
He's back. It sounds like he's searching.
60 seconds passed and there were no more footsteps to be heard. Not one single movement. His face turned red. The thought of being able to hold his breath for much longer became problematic. This would be the perfect time for a squawking crow or some gunfire to help mask the sound of his exhaling. But still, only silence. Only the gentle rustling of palm trees against the calm wind.
Josh is quiet.
Too quiet. Unable to continue and praying for the man to have somehow left the scene without him hearing it, Frank exhaled. As his chest rose and fell, the blood in his face receded. With a second breath, Frank sat up and planted himself on his knees, peeking over the shrubbery. Josh was gone. He came back for him. Frank motioned for his revolver, opened the empty cylinder, and reached into the breast pocket of his blood-stained uniform. he pulled out a single golden bullet and loaded the revolver. His father's bullet. He angled his arm upward, aiming the revolver at the darkness of the jungle, patient and still, waiting. But time was precious. Josh wouldn't last much longer. At some point, he had to take initiative. Otherwise, Josh would bleed out. They may have already killed him. A gunshot in the distance ahead. With his sights locked on the thicket, Frank waited for any sign of movement, ready to strike. 10 more seconds, then I'll go in myself. A cracking branch. A tousling of leaves. There he is. Breathe. Don't give away your position. A limb. A shoulder. A face. Josh. Frank breathed a heavy sigh of relief. However, that relief was immediately intercepted by a powerful surge of anxiety. As the second half of his body appeared from the thicket, Frank could see that Josh was holding a gun to his own head. The revolver trembled in Frank's hands.
Josh, stop! I'm gonna be a hero, Frankie. Just like Dad. Just like Dad.
Josh's eyes closed tightly, preparing to embrace the bullet as Frank watched the hammer slide back on Josh's gun. Frank cocked his arm to the left and fired his revolver. A deafening groan of torment catapulted itself from Josh's grimacing face, and a splash of blood bloomed in the air behind him. Josh's gun dropped to the grass. It had happened so quickly, Frank was left unsure of the outcome, though he was certain he had hit him. Frank ran to his brother, the tears in his eyes blurring his approaching view to what could possibly be his brother's blood-stained corpse. But another boisterous groan from Josh extinguished that worry. Frank wiped his eyes and, turning over the revolver in his hand, gritted his teeth while listening to his brother's pain, criticizing him for saving his life.
It doesn't matter what you do, Frankie. You can't save me. I don't want to be saved. Not anymore. I can't be. Lasting's not part of the plan.
Frank's eyes welled up once again as he struck Josh across the forehead with the butt of his revolver, knocking him unconscious with the first blow. He couldn't listen to it anymore. The declarations of a soldier hell-bent on ending it all. He wiped his eyes and quickly applied pressure to the gunshot wound on Josh's forearm. Frank positioned himself in the grass. The thought of investigating the Huey's crash site entered his mind. Though unlikely, there might be a small chance that the radio was still operational. He couldn't seem to remember if any other gunners had planned on scanning the same area around this time, but he still had hope for American soldiers to show up and take them back to base. With an exasperated sigh, followed by a cough, Frank rested his head against the trunk of a palm tree. He grabbed Josh by the shoulders and pulled him up, resting his head in his lap. He gently stroked his brother's blonde hair, looking down at his peaceful expression. Starting to sob, the image of their mother appeared behind his eyelids. The thought of her brought a brief smile to his face. The memory of her voice, her comforting goodbyes each morning after breakfast as he rushed through the front door toward the school bus with Josh by his side. The warm touch of her hand as she would brush his hair back before being tucked in to say goodnight. The love was undeniable. These scenes played on a loop inside his mind. Of course, she was distraught to hear that her 2 sons were suddenly being shipped off to war. What caring mother wouldn't be? And as a World War II widow, how could one stand the worry of losing more family by the unrelenting hand of battle? But while the majority of the country was up in arms over the purpose for such a war, his mother had never become hysterical or protested like the others. Josh had always said it was because she didn't want to appear hurt or affected in any way in front of her boys, and that the tears would come after they had departed. But Frank believed otherwise. He thought it was because she understood. She was strong enough to understand. Frank saw something in her eyes as he stood outside of the depot station after Josh had said his goodbyes. A simultaneous rush of love and pride, accompanied by the blackness of reality. The painful void created by the possibility of death, but acceptance nonetheless, abetted by the simple motion of a coarse and permissive nod, and the handing down of a bullet, the last remaining bullet recovered from his father's revolver. relics from his battle with the SS that Frank had inherited as the eldest. Gold in color, and surprisingly heavier than it looked, Frank had taken it from his mother's hand and secured it inside of the left breast pocket of his uniform. As he turned away from his mother's embrace, locking eyes with Josh through a dirty bus window, he'd known this was their place in history, their destiny, their duty, and they could never be separated for as long as they both lived. That had become Frank's mission, his promise. As he lifted his head from the palm tree, a calming aura infiltrated the air, brushing against Frank's dirty face, settling on the scene, presenting itself with a rush of rejuvenation, as if the area had never been tarnished at all. This very moment, this precise moment in history, as rare as any other, was completely free of the violence of war, of bloodshed, of loss, of torment. A breeze drifted through the jungle, the splashing waves of the South China Sea discernibly audible in the distance. The pleasant rustling of the palm leaves amidst the wind was almost melodic, rhythmic, and honeyed. Dusk was merely an hour away, and the skyline rested upon the ocean's edge with a light purple hue. Frank stood, carefully laying Josh in the grass. The bandage he had applied was secure for the time being. Frank threw his blood-stained knife to the ground and limped toward the shore. In his hand sat the fragments of his father's golden bullet that he had retrieved from Josh's wound. With a handkerchief, crafted by his mother as a replication of the American flag, he carefully wiped the blood from each piece. The tears reappeared, reaching the brims of his eyelids. As he reached for another piece, Frank stopped and looked upon the assortment of gold scattered atop the stars of the American flag in the palm of his hand. The fragments beckoned to him, and he turned his eyes back to Josh. His brother, his family, his father's son, his mother's baby boy. A man with a voice, opinions, wishes, criticisms, and dreams. Someone who is loved and loving, passionate, curious, a student of the world. A prisoner of war, a prisoner of his own mind, victim to the chaos of conflict. To Frank, no one mattered more. And who were these dead men lying next to him? Sons? Yes, of course, maybe fathers, husbands, men with voices, opinions, wishes, criticism, and dreams all their own. What were their passions? They must have had them. As children, they must have grown up watching their fathers, their mothers, their grandparents, or older siblings perhaps, idolizing them, learning the ways of the world, through their eyes, their ideals, their stories, and their experiences, adapting to the discordance, the unpredictability of their reality, of their chaos, of their own minds. With the handkerchief spread across his fingers, Frank looked back at the contents in his hand, the fragments of his father's golden bullet. The gentle rustling of palm leaves, interrupted by an ambush of gusting winds sprinting from the sea, ascended in volume to a harsh crackling, vehement and frenzied, like a raging wildfire, impatient and consuming. The larger, cleaner pieces lay still, sparkling in the sun, while the blood-stained were lost amongst the navy blue patterns of the handkerchief, dirtied and minuscule. An image of Josh as a young boy flashed behind his eyes, his toothy grin, his innocent eyes devoid of trepidation. Frank wrapped the golden pieces tightly inside the handkerchief, sliding it back into the breast pocket of his uniform as he turned to face the beach. With a jarring twist, Frank's head screwed up toward the sky. The familiar sounds of an approaching Huey arose in the distance. Chapter 11. Orcaseye, 1976. The Atlantic waves whispered through the bedroom window. Josh latched it shut before removing the belt from his jeans. Save for the flickering orange glow from the candle on his nightstand, the room was black and deep teal, the hue cast from the massive royal blue billboard stationed just outside his apartment. The billboard hadn't always been there, and it was something of an odd trend as more and more kept popping up throughout the city during the last couple of months, all of which had a focus on advertising televisions, stereos, or announcing the grand opening of the new chain of Explorers electronic stores. Though pretty apathetic to popular technology, one ad apparently had a persuasive effect on Josh, being that he had just purchased a portable cassette player, along with a new Roy Orbison tape a few days ago. Having to buy darker curtains on account of the illumination that poured into his bedroom every night was pretty annoying, but in the end he liked how secluded the curtains made him feel. It created a disconnection, a roping off from the noise of the world, and that calmed him. Usually. When the curtains couldn't do their job, he'd turn to a cigarette. It was the only thing that eased his mind of the cyclical soundtrack of battle. He had become too afraid to close his eyes. All that would play on the backs of his eyelids were looping images of the torture he'd endured, the bloodshed, and the idea of Frank refusing to come home without him. Such a selfish asshole. Why couldn't he take the hint? The last thing he wanted to do was come back to this place, to be left alone with these memories, to wake up every morning the same way, breathless, riddled with anxiety, with insatiable anger. Every other night for the past 4 years, Frank would come over to check on him. Thankfully, this wasn't one of those nights. He always slept a little easier when Frank was gone, knowing he wasn't pacing by the door, waiting to attempt to assuage another night terror. Lately, sleep was the last thing Josh felt he could somewhat grasp onto, but even that was starting to slip away entirely. Anytime he tried to sleep, he'd do exactly what Dr. Alma had told him. Starting with the tips of his toes, he'd focus his mind on relaxing every muscle in his body, gradually climbing up until he could feel his mind dissolve into complete relaxation. The only problem was, that never happened. It was the same every night. When he'd reach the muscles in his stomach, the thrust of the knives would return, warping his meditation, rapid and heavy, carving through his flesh, his abdomen embraced by the warm coat of blood that spilled past his navel and onto the blades of grass beneath him. The swathing heat would collect and engulf, surround his being, and when his eyes opened, there he was, tied down, surrendering all control, back into his tormentor's world, back into the abyss, falling deeper and deeper, hoping for the darkness to finally consume him. But in the end, just as it was 4 years ago, it was always Frank that brought him back to reality. The one that would hit the reset button, so he could relive it all yet again. It was a blessing and a curse, having a brother that watched over him and cared so much. But this wasn't anything to be fixed. It wasn't anything that could be fixed. Therapy had just started a few weeks back, and despite how much Josh had taken a liking to Dr. Alma and her approaches, Frank's obsession with forcing their lives to return to normal had taken its toll on him, and Josh was done trying to get Frank to understand that. At this point, it was nothing but a waiting game, and the clock was about to expire. Josh got on his knees and picked up the cigarette pack on the carpet, already knowing that it was empty. Maybe the cigarette fairy had made a stop while he was sleeping. There was nothing that he wanted more than to light up one last time. With the belt in his hand, he squeezed until the brown leather crinkled, making an impression in the skin on the underside of his burning white knuckles. He studied the spreading cracks as they sprouted across the bending band. He looked toward the closet, but was taken aback by a knock at his open bedroom door. Josh gasped, dropped the belt, and his welled eyes screwed up toward the doorway, locking onto a looming shadow, an anomalous figure holding a peculiar helmet of sorts. It reminded him of Dan. He was a talented pilot and a good friend. His grave, along with many others, stretched along the beaches of the South China Sea, another life plucked by the hands of chaos.
"Hello, Mr. Ascari," the shadow said.
Josh leaned toward the foot of his bed for the pistol duct taped to the underside of the frame. He was well aware that he looked more than suspicious doing so, but he didn't care. You won't be needing that. Josh stopped moving. How could he have known? Who are you? The figure remained a statue in the darkness. A means to an end, the shadow responded. Josh couldn't help but glance at the belt lying next to him, swimming in the fiery orange strands of the shag carpet. The confusion mounted, and Josh swallowed a dry swallow. An end to what? The black helmet in the figure's hands appeared to come to life. A metallic hum buzzed from the thing, but only for a few seconds, and two ovals spiraled into shape within the tinted visor, white and glowing. Once formed, the ovals pulsated before him, increasing with luminescence with each impressive surge of light. Josh was both frightened and entranced. We are Anura, here to erase the catalyst forming in your mind, the catalyst which will ultimately lead you down a path of self-destruction. As we serve. A nightmare. It had to be. Nothing else could explain this nonsense. Josh knew that soon enough the shadow would emerge from the darkness into the light, transform into another of his tormentors. The stifling humidity would flood his bedroom, hold him down, and the torture would ensue. No, not again. Not tonight. Never again. A single tear fell from Josh's cheek, and he screamed. The shadow tilted its curious head, and Josh leapt up from the floor, charging toward the figure, tackling it, throwing its body against the wall. After the collision, the figure emitted a pained grunt and coiled up on the carpet, and Josh could see its cloaked body trembling in fear. Josh, with deep and heavy breaths, picked himself up and wiped away his tears. His eyes locked on the figure, covered in black. Josh slowly backpedaled into his bedroom. He nudged the black helmet with his heel and picked it up. The spiraling ovals of white continued to pulsate before him, but he threw it out into the hall without hesitation and shut his bedroom door. Standing in shock and confusion, catching his breath, Josh thought about Frank. The adrenaline in his body raced as he glanced at the clock. If this were tomorrow night, Frank would be here by now to check on him, to talk, to reminisce, to tell him everything was going to be all right, to say I love you. Josh reached for the belt on the floor, along with the headphones to his cassette player. As the tears streamed from his eyes, he pushed the play button. I love you too, brother, he said aloud, opening the door to his closet, the belt dangling from his fingers.
A candy-colored clown they call the Sandman tiptoes to my room every night, just to sprinkle stardust and to whisper, go to sleep, everything is all right. I close my eyes, then I drift away into the magic night. I softly say a silent prayer, like dreamers do. Then I fall asleep to dream my dreams of you.
Chapter 12. Orcaseye. Present day. December 13th. 3 class periods to go until Christmas break officially began. This was the first thought to come to Jeremiah as he woke up in bed, still wearing what he had worn to work the previous day. Usually, the thought of a break was greeted by a rush of excitement. Time to sleep in, recharge, spend time with family. But all that was different now. This would be his first Christmas without Julianne. His first Christmas without their trip to the mountains, without sending out their couple's Christmas card, without putting on her favorite Christmas movie to fall asleep to on Christmas Eve after baking a fresh batch of brownies. Santa Claus is coming to town. He'd always joke about having a crush on Jessica Claus. If there were a claymation version of Julianne, they'd look identical to each other. The mention of it always creeped her out, but made him laugh. He smiled to himself in bed as his memories projected themselves onto the ceiling. That smile quickly faded. He swallowed his sullen feelings. It's been longer since they'd had a Christmas like that. 2 years to be exact. Because of the cancer, Christmas hadn't been anything to celebrate for a while in this house. For a moment, the silence felt unwelcome, until his smile found its way back. Wherever she was, he thought, he hoped she was happy, fulfilled. He turned onto his side and was met with the sight of the blue silk hydrangeas on his nightstand, a token from his wedding day he'd always kept with him. They had shrouded the aisle, the altar, and every table at the reception. It was the perfect day, and Julianne couldn't have looked more beautiful if she'd tried. Jeremiah's reverie was cut short as soon as he heard the sound of his front door shut. Jeremiah sprung up from bed and waited for any subsequent sounds. He gripped the edge of the mattress and removed the comforter. Keeping an eye on the open bedroom door, he reached for the bat underneath his bed. He wasn't expecting anyone to show up. He hadn't for months now. Cautiously exiting the bedroom, inching his way through the hall, Jeremiah remained alert, poised to swing. He'd never dealt with an intruder before. The tile floor was cold against his bare feet. The darkness enveloping the house indicated overcast skies, possibly snow, knowing how cold it felt inside. As he reached the end, he stepped back and propped himself against the hallway wall leading into the living room. He peeked his eye over the wall's edge just enough to catch a glimpse of the room's entirety. No sign of life from what he could see. "Hey, who's there?" he shouted. No response. He leaned further past the edge of the wall to get a better view. Nothing. Nobody. The only movement was the muted sight of the steady snowfall behind closed blinds. Now the entirety of his body moved into the living room, the bat in his hand still ready to strike. The sound of an accelerating car came from outside and descended into the distance. He turned toward the entryway, and that's when he saw it. Sitting on the ground just in front of the door, with a single index card leaning against it, was a black helmet. The message on the card made him weak. "As we serve." Gripping the bat as tight as he could, Jeremiah slowly moved toward the helmet. A rush of rage and confusion grew more intense with every step. Unblinking, he waited for the thing to turn on, for the spiraling white ovals, for Frank to walk through the door. Why was this here? Where was Connor? Why couldn't they just listen to him? Now only feet away, no new advancements. The helmet remained inactive. Jeremiah pulled his arms back, clenching his teeth, ready to destroy the hunk of plastic with a single blow. He readjusted his grip on the bat. Just before he released all of his energy into the swing, a new sound presented itself in the entryway. It was difficult to discern, but it sounded like faint shouting. He slipped on a pair of house shoes near the door, unlocked it, and walked outside. Every inch of ground was blanketed with snow. As he carefully walked closer to the sidewalk, the mysterious sound grew dull. He turned to look down each side of the street in search for clarity. Nobody was outside, save for a few trying to get warm inside of their cars before heading to work. He turned back, the aluminum bat still dangling from his hand, and walked up the front porch steps. The shouting became louder as his feet crunched through the snow on the concrete below. He looked back at the helmet. Though unsure, it might have been possible that the sounds were coming from the helmet itself. As he bent down, he leaned the bat against the wall and reached for it. Standing back up, it was clear that the sounds of screaming grew much louder. He turned the helmet over in his hands and angled his ear toward it. There was no doubt what the source was now. Though still faint, he could tell that it wasn't the sound of multiple people screaming. It was just one. The scream was agonizing, painful, desperate. As he turned the helmet over in his hands in search for volume controls, the next thought that came to his mind made him sick. Something about the intonation of the voice behind the screams told him that they belonged to Connor. He stopped and reached down for the index card. Beside the single message on the front, there was nothing else written. Dropping the card, Jeremiah turned the helmet over, staring into its vacant eyes, demanding an answer. Some sort of contact or communication. But he had no idea how to get it. And there was no way he'd ever resort to putting the thing on his head. The screaming wouldn't stop. It kept pouring out of the speakers. Worse yet, it didn't sound as if it were a recorded loop. It sounded as if it could possibly be a live feed. Again, he walked outside with it, all the way into the middle of the snowy street. He turned back and looked toward the sky, the desperation in his eyes mounting. "Frank, I know you can see me. Where is he, you son of a bitch? What have you done?" Jeremiah's voice echoed across the sky, and the silence returned with it a new discovery. The volume of the screaming had increased. "What the hell?" Jeremiah whispered to himself. He held out the helmet in front of him as if it were some sort of explosive device, turning to head west. After walking nearly 20 feet, he noticed the volume had gradually decreased, so he turned to face east. He took several paces down the street, his ear against the helmet, and the screaming coming from the speakers grew louder with every step. He couldn't turn back now. There was no other choice. As he marched through the neighborhood, he stayed locked onto the helmet, pursuing any direction that would cause the volume to ascend. When he reached the end of the block, he wondered if he had locked his front door for a moment, or even closed it for that matter, but the concern didn't last long. All he cared about was following the sound of the screaming. He persisted. During his journey, passers-by had their phones out, filming Jeremiah as he trekked through the middle of the street, holding the black helmet out in front of him as he did so, unaware that he had now entered a much busier intersection. The snowfall started to dissipate, but the frigid air only grew worse as time passed. Horns blared, people cursed at him in annoyance as they drove by, but none of it affected him or stole his attention in the slightest. The screams from the helmet continued to swell, and he picked up his speed as Orcaseye High School faded into view from ahead. Nearly tripping over a sizable cavity in the concrete below, Jeremiah gathered his balance and turned back. The splashing sounds from the demolished fire hydrant surfaced in his memory as he scanned the familiar area. The scene of the accident, the paramedic, the moment where everything almost came to an end. For the first time while meandering through the city, Jeremiah stopped to reflect. To this day, the cause of the crash remained uncertain. All he could remember was the icy water, the crowd of people around him, the long-awaited return of the sun, and the anger. The scalding, insatiable anger. Jeremiah looked up at the low-hanging clouds hovering just below the tallest skyscrapers, transparent and fluid, drifting atop the city with ease. The air was moist and sharp. He closed his eyes and Julianne's text message scrolled behind his eyelids. Stopped on the curb, the surrounding crowd grew larger. More eyes, more phones, more disconcerting looks and laughter. The screams echoed through the streets, and he clutched the helmet with an unabating grip. From a distance, the sound of the bell signaled the start of the school day, and here he was, outside in the cold, alone, unaware of the scene he's caused, unaware of anything except for the young man at the forefront of his mind. When he opened his eyes, it wasn't the sight of the crowd that startled him. On the other side of the street, with an expression of pain and helplessness, Connor stood facing him. Jeremiah, ready to shout to him, felt the adrenaline surge through his body. A news truck raced past, obstructing his view, and when it had left, Connor was gone. Jeremiah shook his head, his eyes wide.
"What? No!"
he shouted.
"Connor!"
He scoured the area from his side of the street, but found nothing. His legs began to move once more toward the high school at a much faster pace than before. Class had begun, but he couldn't care less. Some students walking onto campus late were calling out his name, probably staff as well, but he didn't acknowledge them. His focus remained on the screams. He passed the high school, past the parking lot, past all locations in the city that had played a part in his usual daily routine, and felt weak. Jeremiah's legs stiffened from the cold, and his pace lessened severely as time moved on. Hours later, he found himself stumbling his way through a depot station and stopped to lean against a large crate to catch his breath. He'd convinced himself that he was getting closer. To what exactly, he didn't know. But he'd follow the screams with every climbing decibel, and after this long, there was no stopping now. He had to find Connor. He had to make sense of it all. After a brief rest, he continued. Just outside of the desolate depot, he had reached the outside edge of the city. The cyclical metropolitan soundscape began to fade behind him. Ahead, the countryside stretched on as far as the eye could see. As he passed the highway on-ramp, he eventually found himself on a curving road where Expenditure Avenue ceased to exist. An icy breeze passed over him, and Jeremiah buttoned his jacket as he sauntered past a perimeter of dead trees. For the first time since he had left the scene of the accident, he looked up, gazing at the gnarled black branches reaching toward the pale sun obscured behind a heavy charcoal haze. As he marched toward rural nothingness, blank spaces of sound filled the air, and between those spaces, the screams were the loudest they'd been all morning. Chapter 13. Dusk. The trail of dust behind Jeremiah floated into the atmosphere, evaporating, giving way to a skyline layered in dark orange and navy. The city lights twinkled under a blanket of haze in the distance, now miles back. An insatiable thirst clawed up his throat as he climbed a dirt hill, and he turned back to face the shrunken city once he'd reached the top. The snow had long disappeared now, and he'd lost count of how long he'd been walking, but it was safe to say that he wouldn't be able to last much longer. There was no desire to satisfy his thirst, nor rest his sore legs. All that existed was the desire to keep following, to locate the source of anguish, of its identity, to discover once and for all if it did in fact belong to Connor. He had to know the truth. His vision grew dimmer as the night draped itself upon his side of the world, but he had to keep moving. He had to be close to finding something. As he turned his head forward, nothing but desolation stretched beyond the curvature of the hill he stood on. Flat, eternal, but there was no turning back, despite the likelihood of finding anything to provide him with any sort of clear explanation. Atop the highest point between Orcaseye and the ever-expanding countryside before him, Jeremiah faced the horizon. An amber crescent sun with sharpened ends, shuddering, sinking below a dark purple curtain, and within the sliver of burning orange, a frenzied flickering drew nearer. The speck of black morphed into a more discernible, familiar shape. Transparent blue wings danced with the remaining light as a butterfly fluttered over Jeremiah's shoulder and down the dark side of the dirt hill behind him. Jeremiah's head tilted downward to his right and lingered. After a moment of somber silence, it lifted again toward the edge of the earth, greeted by darkness, and Julianne's angelic smile painted the ground. He blinked, and she disappeared. The screams inside of the helmet had now become white noise to Jeremiah, a continuous loop of agony. He thought of shattering the helmet from time to time, all to give himself a moment to breathe, to reflect, to enjoy the silence, to ask himself if what he was doing was worth his time or just utterly insane. It had all metamorphosed into a vivid, surreal nightmare. Instead, he removed Julianne's golden necklace from his pants pocket, laying the pearls evenly across his palm. He was never able to separate himself from the necklace. He took it everywhere. He took her everywhere. He looked upon the golden butterfly sitting directly in the center of his hand, then up toward the flat land, into the darkness, with entirely different questions forming in his mind. Who could be insane enough to try to stop him from discovering the truth, from finding Connor, from doing everything in his power to make that young man stop at his own reflection and think, "I matter"?
Yes,
Jeremiah said aloud as he descended.
nothing matters more.
As his feet dragged through the dirt, the darkness was no longer the obstacle to overcome while attempting to navigate his aching body. Once the sun disappeared completely, the cold had become unbearable almost instantly. As the minutes passed, each puff of air he exhaled into the night sky expanded in circumference as they followed each icy breath. His joints stiffened more with every foot forward. He licked his lips, cracked, numb, and bleeding. Though the city was miles away, the distant illumination had still made it possible to see the snowfall return, slowly piecing together a blanket of white beneath his feet. And after traversing another desolate, lonesome mile, the sound of Jeremiah's weakening stride gradually turned from scrapes against the dirt to trudges atop the snow. There was a lot of time he had to think along this journey of his, but it was impossible to deter his mind from the awful screams.
Forgive me,
he groaned to himself, stopping in the snow after feeling the surrender of his body. He shook his head, damning his weakness, and kept moving, keeping his focus on the muscles in his legs. After 3 more seemingly impossible steps forward, Jeremiah's heel collided with something protruding from the snow. He stopped and sat the helmet down carefully atop the fresh white powder. With his hand, his exposed fingers swollen and numb, Jeremiah reached toward the ground and grabbed onto what felt like some sort of metal ring. A latch. A door. He grabbed hold of it, pulled with every morsel of strength he could conjure, and a rush of warmth greeted him as the large wooden hatch creaked open. Inside, a metal ladder led to darkness. The snow drizzled along the sides of the hatch and cascaded into the recesses of the chasm. Jeremiah grabbed the helmet, turned his aching body, and descended, fearful, but willing to discover, willing to confront all that lies beneath. Chapter 14. From above, the wooden latch closed itself. At the very least, Jeremiah thought, the cold was no longer an obstacle. Claustrophobia sank in as he continued downward, the screams bouncing across the darkness of the enclosed metal tube. Every 10 steps down or so, Jeremiah had to stop to switch arms, one to assist his descent, the other to protect the helmet. In time, exhaustive, everlasting time, a light appeared beneath his feet, and though Jeremiah felt the desire to speed up to reach the bottom, he knew how important it was to conserve his energy, his strength, his mind. Cautiously taking the last step down from the ladder, Jeremiah groaned as his feet hit the marble floor. The soles of his shoes were worn, deteriorated, though he was surprised they'd made it as far as they did given the conditions. He looked up from where he came and saw nothing but blackness. Stealing his attention, a gradual succession of white overhead lights illuminated a short corridor in front of him, and he looked ahead. The oval corridor led to 2 solid gold doors, reminiscent of elevator doors. The reflective surface was so pristine it appeared as if the gold was artificial from where he stood, as if the doors were nothing more than a mirage. But Jeremiah continued forward. With every cautious step, the lights above flickered on and off, some turning from white to blue, others turning off completely. He quickly learned that the corridor was much longer than he had anticipated, and he couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was being watched. When he finally reached his reflection at the gold doors, it took a moment for him to recognize the man staring back. A ghost, an unfamiliar entity. Jeremiah despised looking into mirrors, but there was something he caught a glimpse of that brought a brief smile to his face. As he gazed upon the mutation of a man, he saw something he hadn't noticed about himself in months. His eyes. Despite the exhaustion, despite the soreness spreading across his body, dominating his withered limbs, the hours upon hours of listening to the tortured screams, he was focused. There was a purpose cemented in his eyes, a purpose that emanated a feeling long lost, a feeling drowned within the depths of his soul lifetimes ago. It was difficult to maintain eye contact with this specter staring back, though he allowed himself to embrace the warmth of the sensation, the flow of endorphins, the invigorating return of adrenaline, of pride. He couldn't have been more proud of himself for taking this journey, for making it as far as he'd come. In an instant, the reflection disappeared as the doors slid open in front of him, revealing yet another chamber of stark emptiness, and reality had swallowed all but uncertainty. The journey wasn't over yet. New questions sprouted in his mind. What was there to be proud of exactly? Nothing had been accomplished. Nothing had been solved. Connor was yet to be found. The answers were yet to be discovered. Jeremiah stepped into the chamber, the gold door shut before him, and again, helmet in hand, he descended. He remained still within the elevator, patient and nervous. In minutes, the chamber slowed until it came to a gradual halt. The door slid open to darkness. The screams were now loud enough to destroy the speakers at any moment.
"Step forward, Jeremiah,"
a soft voice echoed from the distance. With hesitance, Jeremiah stepped out of the elevator and into the black room. Just as it had within the small corridor above, a succession of lights flashed on one after the other, slowly revealing a room that could hardly be defined as a room at all. The ceiling stretched on for eternity, the architecture similar to that of a Gothic cathedral or castle. But most unsettling was the fact that the entirety of the massive space was covered in mirrors. Steel panels with a strong enough reflection to make the space appear to expand as far as the eye could see, regardless of where one chose to look. Despite the size of the place and the fact that Jeremiah's reflection created hundreds of clones occupying the walls, there was an emptiness that made him feel utterly alone. The voice returned.
"Impressive work finding us, Jeremiah. Truly."
There was no doubt in his mind who the voice belonged to. Jeremiah did some commanding of his own.
"Show yourself, Frank."
Merely yards ahead of Jeremiah, Ascari appeared, stepping upward from a silver staircase stationed beneath a circular gold-plated platform. There was that uniform again. The sight of it angered Jeremiah. Black, and on the breast pocket, the gold pin gleamed against the light. One thing was obvious. Its presence had overstayed its welcome. Jeremiah waited for him to speak. Ascari positioned his arms behind his back.
"I see you brought it with you,"
Ascari said after stepping into Jeremiah's view.
"Good."
Jeremiah looked down at the screaming helmet under his arm, then back at Frank.
"Where's Connor?"
he asked, devoid of any timidity. Frank smiled.
"He's right here, Jeremiah. You're just not looking hard enough."
Jeremiah glanced to his left, then to his right. His reflection stared back, nothing more. No sign of Connor.
"I'm not playing any games with you, Frank. Just tell me where he is so this shit can end." "End?"
Ascari questioned.
"Anura never ends, Jeremiah. I know you did something to him."
Jeremiah held out the helmet, displaying it to Ascari. The screams persisted, the most painful they had sounded all day.
"I came here, all on my own. I never stopped listening to this pain, this torture. Never. Because I know this is Connor. Because I know I can help him. Better than anyone else can. That boy is now the best version of himself. No thanks to you, Ascari retorted. You never gave me enough time. Instead, you've done God knows what to him, and I need answers. Your answers are right here, Jeremiah. In this room. With us. With all of us. Again, Jeremiah looked to either side, then over his own shoulder. Again, nothing but his own reflection in the mirrored walls. Us? There's nobody here, Frank. Just you and me. That's always been your problem, Jeremiah. Always such a false sense of certainty, Ascari said, followed by the jarring sound of hermetically sealed compartments sliding open one after another. On either side of Jeremiah, multiple panels instantly morphed into glass holding cells, containing dozens of people, appearing unconscious or comatose, some with eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. In the cell directly to Jeremiah's left, his forehead pressed against the glass, Connor lay bound on his knees, mouth agape, unresponsive and motionless. Jeremiah collapsed to his knees. His eyes locked onto Connor with emphatic disbelief. His voice wilted at the sight of him, brittle and wrought with disgust. No. The screams continued. The initial shock took its time. Jeremiah sat speechless on the steel platform beneath him, choking back the urge to vomit. The blood drained from his face as he shifted his focus to the rest of the incarcerated victims. None of the faces rang familiar until he reached one woman in particular. Her slender neck, the pink scar. Her arms were tied to a hook on top of her cell. It looked like she was breathing, alive. Her feet couldn't reach the ground. The memory of her standing behind his car in the parking lot flashed before his mind's eye. 2 cells to the right, the man with white hair, the paramedic. His back lay against his cell wall, slumped over, with no clear indication that he was breathing. With the exception of Connor, Jeremiah concluded that the victims were all members of Anora. There must have been 30 of them here, maybe more. What have you done to him? To them? Jeremiah questioned, refusing to make eye contact with Ascari as he kept his focus on Connor. A tear rolled down his cheek. Ascari emitted a low, grumbled chuckle. I'd like to introduce the new and improved children of Anora. From the platform, Ascari began pushing buttons on a square control panel, and soon after, a digital screen, affixed atop the golden elevator, projected an image of a man Jeremiah did not recognize. Under the image, bold green text started to crawl on top of the image. Joshua Ascari. Mr. Drake, I'd like to introduce you to my brother, Josh. I'm sure you remember him well. Jeremiah's mind retreated back to the hospital minutes after he had almost attempted suicide. The day he met Frank. The day Julianne beat her cancer. To say the memory was fresh would be an understatement. Ascari continued. I won't waste your time walking you through his story again, but just in case you've forgotten. The photograph on the screen switched from what looked to be an ordinary driver's license photo to the grisly image of Frank's brother's corpse hanging from a belt inside of a closet. Jesus Christ, Jeremiah muttered under his breath. He turned away from the sight. This is our enemy, Jeremiah, Ascari said as he pointed at the screen. It simply has no place on this earth. No business poisoning the minds of those we love most. And until now, Anora has failed to extinguish this enemy. We've made progress without question, but it's not enough. Ascari lingered in silence for a moment atop the platform and turned off the digital screen. He placed his arms behind his back as he stepped down the silver staircase. Once he reached Jeremiah's level, he turned to face him. Anora has evolved, and Connor is proof of that, Jeremiah. They are all proof of that. Jeremiah lifted his head and locked his eyes onto Ascari's. What did you do to him? You piece of shit.
Ascari inched his way closer, and Jeremiah's eyes widened in fear. He wanted to get up, but his legs demanded rest. Reaching downward, Ascari pulled the helmet from Jeremiah's arms, admiring his own reflection in the tinted visor.
Give that back to me.
You were right in determining who the screams belonged to, Ascari explained, holding out the helmet with both hands. He motioned toward Connor's cell.
Before I stole his essence, I learned a great deal about that young man. People tend to reveal their true selves just before their descent into darkness,
Ascari said with a smile. He looked at Jeremiah.
He was much more of a coward than I had anticipated.
Jeremiah sat back, incredulous as he leaned his worn body against his elbows on the steel platform beneath him. He inched himself backward, attempting to increase his separation from Ascari, though Ascari continued forward with the helmet in his hands. The urge to vomit had returned.
These devices of ours are much more adaptive than you might realize, Jeremiah. They not only bestow special abilities upon the wearer, but they recognize and can be overpowered by the intentions of the pursuer as well, as long as that pursuer is determined enough. A feat that until last night had been but merely theorized. I took it upon myself to put that theory to the test, and it seems to be that Connor is ready to serve Anora's ultimate purpose.
Ascari walked toward Connor and placed the helmet down in front of his cell. An intense rage pieced itself together inside of Jeremiah's chest, and Ascari continued.
When a potential client refuses treatment, it has been rumored for decades among the children that if one passionate enough forces our device upon that same client, the energy within would then mutate into that of a harboring parasite, enacting on the intentions of the enforcer, withdrawing the client's essence, ultimately leaving the mind to bend to his or her will.
Ascari clarified, walking among the incarcerated, gliding his hand across the glass of each and every cell.
But,
Ascari continued,
nobody among the team would dare try such a thing, because it just isn't the right thing to do. Right, Jeremiah?
Ascari turned to face him once more.
Isn't that what you believe in? Everyone deserves to have the choice.
Jeremiah gathered as much strength as he could to pull his body up from the steel floor. He brought himself to his feet.
Of course that's what I believe in.
Ascari laughed.
Is that what you gave Connor? A choice? When you forced him to attend those dreadful meetings? I wasn't altering his state of mind. I wasn't turning him into a goddamn vegetable, Frank. You failed, Jeremiah. After giving you months, that young man still possessed the desire to take his own life. I needed more time. I would have figured out another way. Unlike you, I understand his pain. I've carried it with me. I've listened. No, your time is up. Anora has discovered the solution. Consider yourself lucky. Connor is still here. I will never be able to see my brother again. But with this new evolution, this new chapter in Anora's history, we will ensure that no person will ever have to endure the heartache of losing a loved one to suicide, ever again, as we serve. Spare me your bullshit, Frank. You call this a solution? These people will never be the same because of you. Can't you see that? Somehow, someway, you've made everything worse. Anora hasn't evolved. You've deformed it, tarnished it. It's over.
Ascari remained collected, calm.
All I see are lives preserved, lives saved from the clutches of chaos. Connor is alive because of us. Because of me, not you. The rage inside of Jeremiah's chest now surged throughout his entire being. That impulsiveness he had worked so diligently to keep at bay struggled to remain fettered. His strategies, his tricks, his breathing techniques, he attempted all of the psychological practices he had learned on his own. But the image of Ascari attacking Connor, innocent and unassuming, dominated his focus. Before he could suppress the urge, Jeremiah found himself charging toward Ascari, his fists clenched, coiled to strike. Ascari, clearly unprepared for any sort of physical altercation, cowered beneath Jeremiah, crumbling closer to the ground with each and every blow. Blood sprayed onto Connor's glass cage, and the steel panels below were decorated crimson. Jeremiah became a vehement storm, fueled by his indignation, his anger, his impotence, and most of all, his inability to save Connor from this hell. To protect him, to pull him from the darkness, from the relentless grip of chaos. Out of breath, straddled over Ascari's bloodied, motionless body, Jeremiah reached for the helmet, lifted it above his head, and screamed alongside Connor's incarcerated psyche, his anchored essence, drowning out the agony, the pain, the torture, with that of his own, poised to slam the helmet into Ascari's skull. Transparent blue wings flashed before Jeremiah's eyes, and he heard a faint voice call his name. Jeremiah.
The voice called, fragile and petrified. Ascari tapped at Jeremiah's waist with a trembling hand. Jeremiah looked down.
The helmet,
Ascari grumbled through broken teeth. Jeremiah, still holding the helmet in the air, attempted to sidestep the adrenaline and collected himself.
It has to be you,
Ascari declared. Jeremiah listened intently. He looked at Connor, lifeless inside of his glass cage, and back at Ascari.
It has to be you.
Ascari's eyes rolled over, and his head fell backward, emitting a low, broken sigh. The tension in Jeremiah's arms faded. He pulled himself up from Ascari and hobbled toward Connor's cell, the helmet secured under his arm. As he drew closer, Jeremiah caught his own reflection in the glass, his face overlaying Connor's. He placed his blood-stained hand onto the glass and repositioned his body. Clanking onto the steel platform below, Julianne's necklace fell out of his pocket. The golden butterfly gleamed against the light, traversing across the entirety of the colossal mirrored cavern. Jeremiah placed the helmet down and picked up the necklace, readjusting the pearls to lay evenly across his palm. The tears streamed past his crinkled smile, locking eyes with the golden butterfly dangling from the center. For the first time during his journey, this precise moment in time, as rare as any other, was completely free of conflict, of anxiety, of uncertainty. He nodded to himself in acknowledgement of what was to come, what had to come. Julianne's words reverberated in his memory.
I really hope you can find something that gives you the strength to help push yourself past this, because you are not the man I married.
He secured the necklace back inside his pocket and turned back to face Connor. Jeremiah felt for a latch to open the cell, and his attempts produced no results until he noticed a small keyhole on the top right corner of the glass door. He paused, thought, and looked back at Ascari's battered body. Jeremiah leaned over, reached into the breast pocket of Ascari's uniform, and pulled out a small silver key. Turning back with a boisterous groan, Jeremiah hastily inserted the key and opened the cell. As soon as the glass door swung open, Connor's comatose body fell into his arms. Jeremiah froze, blindsided by anguish, overcome by spasms of sorrow. He wrapped his arms around him, holding on to Connor with an unyielding grip. Connor's skin felt cold. He was unresponsive and pale. Jeremiah leaned him back to see his face. Connor's neck draped over his forearm, and his eyes opened for a moment, then quickly closed once more. His lips twitched, and the muscles in his cheeks contracted. A bubble formed at the center of his bottom lip and disappeared as it burst into the air with a wet plop. His limbs remained heavy. Still, Jeremiah waited, repeating Connor's name again and again, gently rocking his fragile body back and forth as though comforting a newborn baby boy. To Jeremiah, no one mattered more. Captured within each panel of the castle's mirrored walls, Jeremiah's embrace of Connor was painted over every surface, every edge, every curve, sprawling across the structure's eternal existence, like millions of steadfast constellations, twinkling above a vibrant, velvet skyline. Chapter 15. Thank you for going through with this, Mr. Moore. I assume it wasn't easy to agree to initially, given the state of your son, along with knowing our operation is very much in its infancy. Slumped over at the dining room table, he signed the contract and dropped the pen. With a brittle voice, obviously stricken with embarrassment, he responded, "No, thank you, Miss Miller. Without you, without this, I'd be dead. Please, call me Gina K. And I have to say, this is just wonderful to see. Having the courage to reach out for help is by far the most important step." Mark sat back and couldn't help but sneak a glance at the scar along Gina K's neck. It was the only part of her body that was visible. Everything else was covered by an immaculate one-piece black uniform. And, fastened to the breast pocket, a golden pin, shaped like a small butterfly. His eyes veered back to hers before making it obvious that he was staring. "I'm not doing this for anybody but my son. He deserves a father, a real father." Gina K closed her eyes with a smile and nodded. "How is he?" Mark fought against the tears welling up behind his eyes. He turned to face Connor's bedroom. "It's just nice to finally have him awake again." "Has he communicated with you at all?" "No, not vocally. A few unclear expressions, but no real emotions quite yet. He's been getting better at ringing his bell while he's hungry, at least." Gina K smiled. "Progress is progress, Mr. Moore. One cannot reform the fragments without patience. There's no telling what kind of long-term effects will stay in place at this point, but at the very least, we can celebrate the fact that he is gradually remembering how to function. He'll be calling you Dad again in no time," she assured. Mark's lips folded into a smile that had disappeared in an instant. "I appreciate your optimism, Gina K, but if you don't mind, I'd like to know what happens next." She said, pausing, and her face appeared flushed. She laughed to herself and took a moment to clear her throat. "My apologies. Of course, Mr. Moore. Let us begin." Gina K pulled a small white box from a blue duffel bag next to her feet and placed it in front of Mark on the kitchen table. The box was pristine, slim, and about 12 inches wide. Small black text was embossed along the lid. "Terra Dream." Gina K placed her hands in her lap and adjusted her posture. She sat up straight and cleared her throat. "Before I reveal the contents of this box, I want you to know that there is nothing to be afraid of. We have done the utmost to ensure that you and your family receive the highest quality of care and oversight. What you are about to see is a tool that will revolutionize patient-to-physician communication. I do not speak lightly when I say that you must never compromise the safety of this device. Are we in agreement?" Mark sat with hesitance. Can this be easily broken?" "That which goes unprotected is always easily broken." Mark absorbed Gina K's words and watched with wonder as she lifted the lid from the box. After she set the lid to the side, Mark was taken aback by a shining band of gold. Gina K lifted the band and displayed it to him by laying it across the palm of her left hand. Across her aged fingers, the gold sparkled against the dining room overhead light. The band was interlaced with multiple pearls, all leading to an ornamented golden butterfly that dangled in the center. 2 blue LED lights were affixed to each wing, blinking steadily. "It's beautiful," he said. "What does it do exactly?" Gina K smiled. "To put it simply, it gives you the courage to push yourself past everything that's clouding your vision. And that's what we're here for, Mr. Moore. When you have nobody to pull you out of chaos, this is how you can reach us." "It doesn't matter what time of day it is?" "Time matters not. Neither does location. Contact us. We'll be here." Mark wanted to ask more questions but didn't want to offend. Gina K noticed his hesitance. "Go ahead, Mr. Moore. Is there something else on your mind?" "Yes, but I don't want to upset anybody." "You won't upset me. Ask away. That's why I'm here today." Mark looked down at the band, then back at Gina K. "As beautiful as it is, do I have to wear it on your wrist at all times?" Gina K interrupted, finishing his sentence. She laughed. "Of course not, Mr. Moore. We're well aware that the device might not suit everyone's taste when it comes to fashion. The design is simply an attribute left non-negotiable by our creator. But I assure you, once all of your communicative devices have synced with the TerraBand, you will have direct contact with us at all times. As long as the TerraBand itself is left protected, nothing will disrupt our communication." Mark nodded. "Good to know. Thank you." "Of course. Would you like to review your privacy terms next?" Mark shook his head and waved his dismissive hand in front of Gina K. "I read over those last night. Turn off all of the privacy inhibitors. I need you listening in. Day and night, around the clock. For now, anyway. Until things get, well, better than they are now." "Understood, Mr. Moore. I will designate your privacy settings. They will be effective immediately once I vacate the premises." Through blurred vision, looking out his open bedroom window, Connor watched as a man approached his home. The man stopped in the driveway, standing perfectly still. The sound of Connor's heart monitor steadily increased as he was unsure of the man's identity or what he was about to do. Connor focused his attention on regulating his breathing to lower his heart rate, just as he had been practicing with the doctors that had been seeing him at home. Connor's vision focused a bit, but he couldn't shake the haze in his eyes. The man, wearing what looked to be some sort of black trench coat, began speaking into a small black radio. Connor could hear everything.
Hard to believe, the man said. He took a deep breath. "We're here. After 8 long months, it's time we put our work to the test. Our people will finally receive the treatment they truly deserve." That voice. "Now, before this day closes, I need someone to pay a visit to Orcaseye Penitentiary. Mr. Ascari is a top priority, along with Mr. Moore. Once we have an assigned team member, confirm with me, please. We'll need someone with a lot of patience."
Yes, sir.
A voice responded.
We'll get that taken care of right away.
A surge of energy shot through Connor's bones. Elation, followed by optimism soon after. Hope, confidence.
"Let's reform,"
the man added. Through the radio, several voices answered back.
The fragments.
Connor's vision began to clear. He squinted, and the man slowly morphed from a black smudge into a shape more discernible, more familiar. The man adjusted the gold pin on his uniform.
"I'm disembarking now. I've got somewhere to be. If I'm needed, you know how to find me."
Jeremiah's voice awakened Connor's memory, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he smiled. Chapter 16. Orcaseye, 4:45 p.m. Placing one last sticky note onto her itinerary, Julianne breathed a sigh of relief. She stuck her notebook into her bag, looked at the clock, and zipped it up with haste before rushing to her phone plugged into the wall. She opened her contacts and selected Dana, a seasoned lepidopterologist she had been corresponding with since her last excursion to Brazil back in April. As usual, the call went straight to voicemail. "Dana, hi, it's Julianne. Sorry I missed you. Just wanted to confirm our flight time for tonight. Get back to me when you can. I'm all packed up and ready." Julianne shoved her phone in her pocket and plopped herself down on the couch. The house was eerily quiet, and she grew agitated. This weekend could very easily be the most important weekend of her career, and Dana was, once again, proving that she was the flakiest partner she ever had to work with. But Julianne had to swallow any ounce of annoyance because Dana was her best shot at finally finding what she'd been looking for. She knew her stuff. That was the bottom line. With her ground skills and Julianne's depth of knowledge, the likelihood of their next expedition being successful was essentially a guarantee if all went according to plan. She had to trust that she'd pull through. Julianne refused to accept another failure. Luckily, Julianne understood the value of patience. That was something she had developed and practiced time and time again being married to Jeremiah. However, as she had learned, even the most patient couldn't blind themselves to an inevitable time bomb. Since the separation, she thought about Jeremiah more than she had liked. Despite how ugly it got towards the end, there was no denying that the good times heavily outweighed the bad. Nobody could make her laugh like he did. Nobody could make her love like he did. But it didn't matter. As often as she found herself missing his presence, she knew she deserved better after all she'd been through. It was a difficult truth to swallow, to say the least. She felt her pocket vibrate and reached for her phone. Dana. "Wow, I think that's the fastest response time you've ever had. Growing up, are we?" Very funny. So our flight's scheduled for 8 o'clock on the dot. I'll pick you up around 5:30. Sound good? Yeah, that's perfect. I'll see you then. Okay, see you soon. As Julianne ended the call, a jarring knock at the door made her gasp in surprise. She sat still for a moment and laughed to herself. She pulled herself up from the couch and tossed her phone into her open suitcase before unlocking the front door. As she pulled open the front door, she was greeted by confusion. No one was there. She inched herself onto the welcome mat, folding her arms into her chest as the balmy summer air swathed over her skin, and looked around, but there was nothing. Her street was vacant, quiet. After forfeiting from her search, she turned to come back inside. Unnerved at the sight of it, she discovered a small white envelope tucked behind the blue hydrangea wreath hanging on the door. She paused and looked back toward her street once more. The sun peered over the neighbors' fences, effulgent light pouring onto the humble suburban cul-de-sac. The asphalt was painted orange, the wind calm. Julianne pulled the envelope from the silk wreath and saw her own name written across the face. Forgetting to close the door, she sauntered back inside, clutching the envelope with both hands, and sat on the couch. It was Jeremiah's handwriting. Though unsure of the contents and nervous about what she was about to find, seeing this had brought her a sense of comfort. There was a particular tenderness involved with recognizing the penmanship of a former love. She lifted the seal and unfolded an extensive letter. His voice was heard with every word she read. Julianne, I've missed you. Not a day goes by where I don't wake up with your smile on my mind. Apologies are not what have brought me to write this letter, though it's impossible to feel anything but sorrow when I think of you. I was selfish. I was wrong. I don't deserve you, and I probably never will. But I'm sorry for everything. Although you have likely already crumpled up this letter at this point, I'm not going to stop writing. I can't help but quell the urge to get all of this out and onto paper. A lot has changed since you left. Thankfully, all for the better. First, I've rekindled my love for teaching. I'll be starting again next fall. Luckily for me, the administration believes in giving fifth chances. Second, I've been getting myself help. My therapist is amazing. The entire experience has been so eye-opening. I'm discovering demons I never knew I had and never knew I could conquer on my own. It's going to take some time, but I can genuinely feel myself healing. In time, I will reform the fragments. But most importantly, in the time we've been apart, I've been building something new, something I'm quite proud of. It's difficult to explain here, but on the day of your surgery, my life changed completely. You deciding to leave may have been the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I may have found something I didn't even know I was looking for. Something that has helped me push myself past all of this chaos, this darkness. Something that has made me remember the man I used to be, the man I always wanted to be. And I'm so thankful. It's rare to find a sense of completion like this, and it's all because of you, for helping me see myself for who I really was. Thank you. I'll admit, a lot of my behavior while we were together was caused by my own selfishness. Seeing you in that awful state for so long took the life out of me, and I always felt as if I couldn't do anything to help you, and this angered me. The cancer stopped everything. We'd always planned on having a baby, but now I know in my heart that starting a family at that point in our lives was obviously not a healthy choice to make. No kid should be forced into a world with a father ill-equipped to provide every ounce of the love and compassion that a child deserves. Now, although it might be too far of a stretch, but after seeing this progress within myself and knowing that you survived your surgery, I feel as if the universe is telling me that there's still a chance for you and I to reconnect in some way or another. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but in order for me to grow, I have to forgive myself, which honestly I've yet to do. But I'm close. I can feel it. Before I do that, though, there are a few things I have to take care of. Do not feel as if contacting me is an obligation of yours. I will understand if you choose to block me out completely. Just know how much I care about you and how much I love you. I can only hope that you're the happiest you've ever been. And I hope you're still pursuing your butterflies. Every time I see one, I think of you. It's impossible not to. Also, I remember you mentioning, as surprising as it may be, a rarity you'd been searching for. The Terra Dream. I haven't forgotten. I hope you find it, Jules. I know you will, if you haven't already. With love, Jeremiah. I've been meaning to give this back. I was just waiting for the right time. You have no idea how many times it saved me. Attached to the bottom of the letter, Julianne's gold necklace dangled over Jeremiah's signature, her favorite, the anniversary gift, interlaced with pearls, leading to a small golden butterfly. She thought she'd lost it forever. With tears in her eyes, Julianne folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. She collected herself and got up from the couch, her necklace in hand. She picked up her phone from her suitcase and proceeded to her list of contacts. She called Dana. Once again, straight to voicemail. Julianne cleared her throat. Dana, hey, it's me. I hate to be the flaky one this time, she said with a laugh, but we need to postpone our flight to the morning. Something's come up. I'll explain everything later. Julianne slid her phone in her pocket and grabbed her keys from the table. Her smile was immovable, emanating a sense of hope that could only be brought upon by the resurgence of a powerful memory, combined with an optimism born from a remolding of trust, of love. Once a melted lump of clay, now an item of time, of growth, of prominence and life, of utter and genuine truth. An item blended, an item shared. Locking the door behind her, giving the wreath of hydrangeas a lasting look of longing on her way out, Julianne made her way toward her car, the gold in her hand, sparkling in the sunlight.